rise. The Maga movement is in part a critique of an unfair, capitalistic system. And we see that play out in terms of trade, for example, this idea of America first. It seems like although Trump's views on tariffs are controversial around the world, among his support base within MAGA, there is quite a bit of support for that because there's a sense that they've been ignored.
I think I would just add to that and say there is a not small feeling, in other words, a relatively widespread feeling that the United States has been taken for granted around the world, that the United States has been the underwriter of global stability over the past 80 years or more, that we have been the underwriters of global prosperity. And so, people feel like, but there's an awful lot of criticism of the United States as well. And so it seems wrong and unfair, and the U.S. needs to level the playing field in fighting back. I think this is part of what's fueling the agenda. But if we come back to your question about capitalism, there has been a feeling, as you rightly point out since the 80s, that the growing disparity between the haves and have-nots has only been greater. And part of really what's at the core of the American ethos is equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of outcome. And some have argued that over the past dozen or more years, the left or the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been pushing an equality of outcome agenda, not an equality of opportunity agenda. And, for most people who feel like they're tired of having their speech corrected, they're tired of having what appears to be other, quotas for other individuals, ABM, anybody but me, and there's a degree of frustration that has grown out of that. Having said all that, I believe our system will eventually correct itself.
Here is another part to this question, which is, and I agree with you in terms of equality of opportunities. The maximum number of billionaires or new billionaires are also coming from the United States. The greatest opportunities that have thrown up mega dollars everywhere has come from the United States. And yet, for people to feel that the American dream, I'm losing the American dream, seems to be on the drift. Where is this contradiction? Why do people feel that money is bad? Why do people feel that big companies are bad? Could it be the manner in which they influence politics? Max?
It's funny because there is that sense, but on the other hand, some of the wealthiest, most influential people in the world can also be heroes politically. So, Elon Musk has, tremendous influence, and he is widely appreciated among Donald Trump supporters for restoring what they see as sanity, restoring free speech, reducing the power of legacy media, which is seen as corrupt. So, yes, you're right. There is tension between the haves and the have-nots, but we do continue to exalt our financial oligarchs, don't we?
Just one second. Let me push on Elon Musk a bit. What we see from a distance, halfway across the globe, is that Elon Musk is as much worshipped as he is crucified on a daily basis. So I think divisive. Over there, also the democratic fissures that are expressing themselves through economic evaluations are also divided there. So what is this divided America? Is it political? Is it economic? What is happening?
What do you think, Shane? I don't really think that it's so much economic. I think it could be well represented in terms of people's, media preferences, in terms of where they live. I think it is more to do with culture than, their net worth is my view.
Jane,
No,
what do you think?
I think that's right. Look, we have a lot of differences among us as Americans. I mean, it's really actually one of our defining national characteristics. Every one of us almost, except Native Americans, are from somewhere else. Speaking multiple languages in households. A third of Americans are second generation or third generation or newer to this country. I think people feel as though they've lost equal access to opportunity. I think it has come because other groups have been privileged as a corrective to decades, centuries, whatever, millennia of privileging other groups. And I think it became, in many cases, too much to bear. What you find, though, every single day are examples of grace, understanding, and outreach among Americans of very, very different political persuasions and economic persuasions. And that is one of our core strengths.
It's likewise in India as well. We have similar problems, and I think all democracies would be having similar problems. So let me ask a more provocative question. Is democracy weakening? Is democracy being weaponized against itself? Is the American democracy being weaponized against itself? Is free speech of America being weaponized by other actors such as China or let's say the other hostile immigrants that are coming, and they're changing the contours of discourse in America?
I think that the media is contributing to this view that with Trump, we're experiencing democratic erosion. But I think that that's really a simplification. I think that there was actually a tremendous amount of democratic erosion under Biden as well, but the media was in on it. So there was plenty of corruption during the Biden administration as well. It's well known, the story about Hunter's laptop and how the Biden campaign solicited the support of basically leading figures in the intel agencies to essentially lie to the American public and lead them to believe that it was a Russian, operation in order to put Biden in a better position to win the debate against Trump. The media was in the tank for Biden in terms of validating his mental acuity when every sentient person knew that that was untrue. At universities, the system was much more biased, which is something that Jane has been alluding to. So in some ways, under Trump, I actually think that we're making some progress, even though that's not the way the media is characterizing his relationship to democracy.
What do you think, Jane?
I don't think democracy, the American version of democracy, again, one of the things about this moment that has been so surprising to me is how little the world understands Americans. And you all think you understand us really very well, and you don't, it turns out, which is what for me has been surprising as someone who has spent my whole career in international work and whose, half of my children live abroad. And so, and they all speak another language.
So what are we unable to see that you would, what would you like to correct?
The American democracy is a special democracy in that it is the rule of the majority with absolute mindfulness of the rights of the minority. And so, for example, in the United States, no religion is as equally protected as any religion under our Constitution. Now, we're undergoing a major re-examination and self-examination of a number of values and principles. But I think fundamentally, the average American is deeply committed to liberal values of individual freedom, individual expression. There is no more fundamental right than a say in how you're governed. And that's what we did. So, have we been introspective before? We have. Have we been self-regarding and America firsting before? We have. And our pendulum swings, and I think it will swing again. This is not the last moment of the United States of America.
Last question. So how does this new America which is driven by a new kind of surge in a new democracy, which has thrown up a new leader, look like over the next 4 years?
I mean, I don't even know that we need to look that far for uncertainty. A real question is what will happen to the current brand of Republican leadership after Trump? You know, will it be able to survive Trump? To such a large extent, the current party is focused on this one individual. So what will advance, you know, presidency look like? How would it be different? Tulsi Gabbard is at this conference. I see her as a potential leader on a national level. She could be the next president. It's possible. And if she were to become president, I think the party would look very different. She has appeal not just among Republicans, but Democrats too. And surely that presidency would look very different as well. So what will the political climate look like in 4 years is very much an open question, I think.
And in terms of foreign policy, therefore, so to extend that question, where are the big changes going to happen? We thought that Trump would be impacting Russia and China the most. It turns out he's impacting and adversely affecting European Union the most in terms of NATO, security covers, and so on. Where is this going? So allies and adversaries are now put on the same platform by Trump in his foreign policy. Where is this going?
Well, I don't know that they're put on the same platform. I think you're fundamentally seeing the president challenge them in an aggressive way to say, re-examine, you know, your first principles here. You say you support us. Have you supported us? Have you fulfilled your burden in NATO? You know, and all the European leaders are lining up now saying, yes, we should have been doing more. We will do more. We are going to do more. So I think that's true. This is a moment where you're really seeing, I think, a reflection of two, you know, sort of approaches to the U.S. role in the world. You know, one is, you know, Democrats seem to be fundamentally uncomfortable with power. They somehow see it as illegitimate and, you know, we're all in charge and, you know, we all get a say. And Republicans, I mean, again, to the extent those terms are useful, and I don't think they are very much, you know, they're uncomfortable with rapid change. Well, buckle up, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we're in the environment of. So which point of view, I mean, the president, whether you like him or not, is articulating a point of view about America's role in the world. What is the alternate party's view? Do they have an idea? How do they describe it? What does that mean ultimately that the United States does? It's not just enough to be against President Trump if you are and his policies, and there are plenty, 50% of Americans are, right? That 50% needs to know what they're for.
Thank you, Jane, Max. And we have the next 46 months to see where this conversation takes us. And being the kind of disruptor Trump is, I feel that we will be changing our bases every 2 months. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The biggest news story the world is tracking is the war in Ukraine and the hectic diplomatic activity to strike peace. And with me today is the man at the center of those conversations, the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Andriy Sybiha. Minister Sybiha, welcome to the Firstpost Raisina Dialogue Ideas Pod.
My pleasure, Nona. Thanks a lot for this invitation and for this opportunity.
The first question that I have for you, and I'm sure the whole world wants an answer to, is, do you think there will be peace this year? The war will end this year?
We believe, and we do really want to end this war this year. Probably all of us are united by this strategic goal to achieve just, comprehensive, long-lasting peace. We had, and after Jeddah, probably, we got additional impulse to achieve this peace. We sped up our efforts, our peace efforts, to achieve once again this peace this year. Ukraine supported U.S. proposal of the ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, and now we are expecting the response from Russian side to accept unconditional ceasefire. It will be a huge step forward to make this peace closer.
Is Ukraine prepared to pay the price for that peace?
You see, we are the country which is suffering from this Russia aggression. 20% of our territory recently under temporary Russian occupation. But also I would like to remind that after 24th of the 2022, and by the way, you visited Ukraine in February 2022, and we do really appreciate this, Ukraine managed to liberate 50% of occupied territories. Nobody believed in Ukraine. Many countries gave us 3 days for our survival, but we prevailed. And of course, we are the country which is mostly interested in achieving just and last and comprehensive peace. No compromises at the cost of territorial integrity and sovereignty. No Minsk III or Yalta II. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. These fundamental points which we need to keep in mind with regard of our peace efforts.
You mentioned February 2022. The world is very different today than it was, including the man in power in Washington, D.C. Do you think that Ukraine is at its weakest position today in this war?
You see, we need to restore world order based on international law. This war is not about Ukraine. This war about restoration of the world order based on respect of territorial integrity and sovereignty, UN Charter. Yes, we should be in more strong position. That's why we need support of international community, of our partners, diplomatical support, economical support, humanitarian support, because it is in the interest of all countries that in Ukraine just and comprehensive peace will be settled. To avoid and to prevent the same developments, I mean, like we had with Russian aggression in other geographies, not to encourage other actors in the world, on the world arena to act the same way. So that's why just and comprehensive, long-lasting peace.
You see, what should be and what is are usually two different things.
But we are very realistic. We understand very well.
But so you've not answered my question. Do you think Ukraine is the weakest today that it has been in this war? Because you had some control of Russian territory in Kursk. That control is slipping. Mm-hmm. Your alliance with Washington looks not as solid as it did some 6 months back. Mm-hmm. And your dependence on Europeans comes with its own risks, because Europe itself depends on the United States for security. So how is Ukraine poised?
Russia didn't achieve any strategic goal in Ukraine. They didn't achieve. We have probably the most strongest army on the European continent, approximately 1 million soldiers with a combat daily experience.
Then how have you lost 20% of your territory?
Because you could compare Ukraine and Russia, 26 times bigger, with nuclear capacities. And we prevailed, despite everything. We prevailed and managed to liberate 50% of occupied territories. We managed to establish grain corridor in the Black Sea and to restrict capacities of the Russian Black Fleet. Our economy works. Also, we are not alone. We have partners and allies which contributed a lot in our resilience, and we are thankful. We are thankful to all of our partners, and here I would like also to express gratitude to India, to your great country, for the constant support of our territorial integrity and sovereignty, and the visit of your Prime Minister last August was really very important and historical one. So having such challenges, we keep situation under the control. Once again, under the control. Russians, they didn't manage to occupy. You see, any strategic point in Ukraine. Any strategic. They didn't. We liberated, for example, Kherson, one of the regional
Minister
centers.
Sibiha, are you weaker today than you were ever in this war, is my question. It's a yes or no
we
question.
could be more stronger.
Yes.
That's true. But having the support of international community, we could proceed and we could achieve just and comprehensive and lasting peace.
President Trump said to President Zelensky that you don't have any cards. And it snowballed into a difficult conversation. What leverage does Ukraine have at this point?
I believe in the strength of my people. I believe in the strength of our soldiers. We have this spirit, high and moral, to resist. Once again, we want to end this war this year. We need support of international community because it's about principles. It's about principles and restoration of the old order based on international law.
Do you believe that your president was insulted in the meeting with Donald Trump at the White House?
President Zelensky is the president of the country which is in war.
Yes.
So that's why he protected his country, he protected his people.
It's a yes or no question.
I explained the position of the president which is in war, of the country which is in war.
I'll tell you why I asked this, because the Americans are mediating this conversation. And do you believe that after what happened in the Oval Office, do you see them as fair arbitrators?
We had really very constructive and productive meeting in Jeddah. We put our bilateral relations on a proper diplomatic way. We gave a good impulse for the intensification, for the further intensification of our bilateral contacts at all levels. We accepted their proposal of the ceasefire. We need American side. We need the engagement of American side. We need their leadership, and we believe that we have an additional opportunity with the President Trump to end this war this year.
He's going to be talking to President Putin today, and Russia has spelled out its position just like you have, and they have some clear demands, including no European soldiers as a peacekeeping force in Ukraine and so on. And it is believed that the United States may be inclined to give some of those concessions to the Russians. If that happens, are you ready to walk back on some of your demands?
Once again, Ukraine accepted this ceasefire unconditionally. The same we expect from Russian side. I remember, believe me, I remember very well first proposal from Russian side from the beginning of this brutal Russian aggression. It was the language of ultimatums and capitulation. They demanded our capitulation, and they didn't change their approach. They don't want to recognize us as an independent state. That's why it is so important to support this peace effort to achieve just and comprehensive, long-lasting peace. Once again, no restrictions of Ukrainian army capacities. What does it mean, just and comprehensive peace? No possibility to restrict our choice to become a member of any unions, of any allies. No compromises at the cost of our territorial integrity and sovereignty. Ukraine will never recognize any part of territories occupied by Russians. So all these things are crucial and fundamental in our peace process. let's start to implement. Let's start with a ceasefire.
Do you think Russia will give up the territory that it controls? I mean, they have the upper hand, it seems, on the battlefield. The Ukrainian soldiers are on the back foot in
once again,
Kursk.
we will never recognize territories occupied by Russia. We
So
will
then
never recognize.
how do you
We
expect
have
to do?
diplomatic tools. We
Yes.
have diplomatic instruments. Now it's a time for diplomacy to demonstrate this power, to pressure. Also, to pressure
Do you
Russia.
think diplomacy will work after more than 2 years of war and thousands of sanctions?
I believe, yes. We could.
What
we,
gives
we
you
could.
the
We could
confidence?
try. We could try to use diplomacy. For example, this meeting in Jeddah.
Yes.
It was really important one, and we could expect further developments. Let's give a chance to diplomacy.
But that
to
meeting came
conduct-
after a
to
lot of
conduct,
pressure
to
from your
implement
allies
this
in the
mission.
US.
So let's give a chance to diplomacy to use all the instruments to achieve just and comprehensive long-lasting
I think that
peace.
would be the best, to give diplomacy a chance,
Yes.
and that is what India
and
has
we
also...
share this approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Ukraine's position vis-a-vis India has evolved considerably since the war began. I believe your predecessor said things like India has blood on its hands. And since then, we've seen the Prime Minister visit Kiev, and we've seen the coming together of both countries, and that is a very welcome step. But if you remain firm on your demands, and the Russians clearly are, with their gains both on the battlefield and increasingly it appears so at the talking table as well. If there is no ceasefire, do you propose to keep fighting?
We are ready to resist. We do not have another choice. For us, this war is an existential one. So we do not have another choice. That's why I am here also to conduct my meetings with my counterparts, to engage more support, to get more support for our diplomatic efforts. Once again, we do really have a chance, diplomatic chance, so-called diplomatic chance, to end this war this year, jointly.
If President Trump agrees to Russia's demands, what are your options?
Once again, we have our position. You ask me once again the same question.
Because you've not answered my question.
We have our position. We will keep this position because for us, we do not have another choice.
But
Thanks a lot.
how do you keep fighting? then?
Thanks a lot. We have enough capacities to keep fighting.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thanks.
Welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod. My name is Luka Nyonyer, Chief Operating Officer of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation in South Africa. Joining me today are two exceptional voices, Dr. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, Prime Minister Moussa Mara, former Prime Minister of Mali. Welcome to you both. Let's dive in.
Thank you.
The international system, as we know it, is fraying at its edges. Africa once again finds itself at the intersection of competition between global and regional powers, seeking strategic advantages in essential minerals and resources. Against this backdrop, violent conflicts persist in regions like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Gulf and the Great Lakes. Conflicts that receive limited attention internationally, yet carry profound implications not just for the African continent and its stability, but for global peace and global stability as well. Comfort, I'll start with you. The Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and the Great Lakes are distinct in their histories, yet they share a common thread of external interference and weak state capacity. Which of these regions do you see as the most urgent flashpoint right now?
They're all urgent, quite frankly. I mean, given the scale of human suffering, the transnational nature of the conflicts, these are effectively internationalized civil wars. And I want to go back to what you said at the opening about where Africa as a continent is located in the international sort of geopolitical landscape. And what is very clear to us is that unlike 20 years ago, for example, where Sudan was at the top of the agenda, these conflicts are deprioritized. It's clear also that regions also have to start taking care of themselves first, because the usual the usual arbiters of these conflicts, Washington, London, Paris, are no longer have the bandwidth to take care of these crises. and the multilateral architecture that we have on the continent, both in the apex of the African Union or regional bodies, really need to start taking seriously conflict resolution in all its scales, whether it's averting, de-escalating, or actually managing the conflicts as well. Because these are three quite seismic conflicts in three of Africa's, out of the 5 regions on the continent, 3 of them are in crisis. And we cannot overstate how severe the situation is today.
And why do we keep missing the warning signs? These are conflicts that keep restarting and over and over.
It's not about the warning signs, it's about political will. It's about deciding that these are crises that you need to deal with straight away rather than rushing to peacekeeping. It's the art of peacemaking and preventative diplomacy. All the regional architectures, and I'm going to single out ECOWAS, the West Africa one, because it is the poster child of everything that we're seeing around the continent. It was the one that took the novel decision, you'll remember, Prime Minister, took the novel decision of saying that for us to really deal with economic integration, we have to deal with security first. And what we're seeing right now is a reversal of fortunes in that architecture that ECOWAS built around peace and security as well. So I think what worries me also is that most of the time these instruments, the multilateral nature of these bodies on the continent itself is in trouble, is in crisis, and is not able to respond in time, even though they've got all the information at their fingertips as well.
Prime Minister, the Sahel region continues to witness these unconstitutional transfers of power and violent extremism, yet global responses remain inconsistent. Even continental responses are inconsistent as well. Why does the Sahel remain misunderstood, and what kind of global action is required to get a hand of what's happening at the moment?
I don't think Sahel is misunderstood. I think we have some huge crises over the world, and the challenge in Sahel is not squared for the global players, and that's why we look like maybe put aside of the different light in the international landscape. In this case, in this environment, we have to try to find the solution on our own, by ourselves. And the regional body, like ECOWAS and the African Union, they have a huge challenge to find the right way to solve the African problem. This is a great deal, but it is not impossible. It is not impossible. The first is the political will. The second is our ability to organize ourselves, to put our strength together, and to deal with the root causes of what we face. And as I regularly say, the problem in our country is not a question of international player. It is a question of internal weakness. The failure of our states and the inability of our states to find the answer to the question posed by the societies. We have to deal with, and I am sure it is possible.
A two-part follow-up, Prime Minister. The leaders themselves, particularly the military leaders, do you see them showing the kind of political will you're suggesting? One. Secondly, ECOWAS has also been very inconsistent. At one part they're suspending, at the next part they're withdrawing the suspension. The countries have now left or are leaving ECOWAS. What's the state of political will at the moment?
The problem of the militaries is they are not fit to lead the country, seriously, profoundly. And they do not understand the substance of our countries and our crises. They answer military by using force, by using weapons. This is the only thing they know, and this is the only way they will go. And it is not enough to solve this kind of problem by only military ways. This is the problem of the militaries. That's why we have to talk to them and to try to convince them, even to put a pressure on them by using the society means, the civil society organization, in order to obtain their withdrawal from the leadership. This is what we have to do. They are not able to find the right solution to Sahelian and other parts of Africa.
Prime Minister, I know, and I'm agreed with you, that the external actors aren't as significant as the media and outsiders seem to think. But let's look at them briefly. The state of the world at the moment is really being driven by this idea of mineral diplomacy that you see primarily out of the US at the moment, but has really been driven by the Chinese and middle powers equally over the last number of years as well. From your perspective, how do these external interests and ambitions for resources shape or influence the kind of conflicts you're seeing across the continent, but also in the Sahel in particular as well?
I am sure if the state is weak, if the state is not solid institution, this kind of external impact will be huge. And even on this way, we need to build a solid institution, democratic ones, a state able to solve its own problem. That will ease the mineral deal if it comes to a question of deal. I am not against the deal. I think we should focus on our interests and work with whoever wants to work with us. If we can solve the problem by making some deal about the resources, yes. But the substance should be state, strength of state, strength of our institution, and our ability to understand our interests, short-term, middle-term, and the long-term interests.
Dr. Comfort, let me bring you in here. This idea of this new scramble for the continent is really interesting when you think about the initial scramble in the late 1800s. What's the risk that this scramble turns dormant conflicts into active proxy wars? And where do you see that playing out most tangibly at the moment?
When hasn't there been a scramble for resources on the continent?
But doesn't it feel more acute at the moment in the same way you're saying in the bigger discussion?
You know, we were saying 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's been a scramble for resources. You know, when I look back to when I started sort of, you know, working across the continent, one of the first two conflicts or three conflicts that I was engaged in, Angola, Sierra Leone and Liberia. And what was the heart of the matter? Diamonds and timber. So these were drivers and things that fueled conflict both internally, when the distribution of the cake is not large enough so that everybody can eat from the cake, and also because of external factors. But it goes back to what you were saying, Prime Minister, as well. When you don't have a consolidation of the state, when you don't have key principles, when you don't have the governance structure, the economic governance structure, so that you ensure that the revenue that's collected is used wisely across the country to enable people, then you fuel grievance, you fuel illicit activities as well. But you're also right to acknowledge the resource dimension of conflicts. I mean, look at what's happening in the Great Lakes now. So President Tshisekedi looks with interest with the mineral diplomacy that you talked about in Ukraine. He says, well, America, come and buy my minerals, because what do we have? We're the richest country when it comes to copper and cobalt, which is used for a lot of the telephones that we're using. Europe's interest, among other things, in the Democratic Republic of Congo today is access to those minerals, access to using these materials, because they're very important back to their industries as well. China is playing a very long game as well in setting up its stall in these countries. One of the reasons why also we're seeing this rush to annex the eastern part of Congo also is not just because of national interest tied to Rwanda's long-standing national security concerns, but it's also an interest in access to those raw materials as well. So there are external forces at play as well, but they also intersect with the fact that you've got a very weak center of gravity that doesn't have a good governance architecture to address those needs. So those two things do collide in the way the Prime Minister was suggesting.
Let's look at just briefly at the global order, and then we'll come back to the continent. Comfort, when the the US withdraws from the global order, at least appears to be withdrawing, the West is going to become increasingly distracted, as I think we were seeing in the panel you were both on. The entire discussion around waging peace was largely focused on Europe and the Middle East. So we must imagine that the West is going to be distracted. How does the vacuum affect peacekeeping and conflict mediation on the continent? What do you anticipate might happen increasingly?
Let me say one thing about this notion that the United States is withdrawing. I don't think it's withdrawing. I think it's redefining its own relationship with a number of countries, a number of regions as well. I think it also wants to negotiate the terms of its continuing engagement. And I mean, well, if you put yourself in the position of President Trump, he feels as that there have been free riders. In fact, it was President Obama who talked about the freeloading as free riders as well. So this is a United States that wants to negotiate the terms of the very structure that it created as well, which it has benefited it as well. And you're right, you're also right, and I think this is what's very worrying for the continent, is that because other countries, your traditional allies themselves are distracted, they've got other priorities as well. You're right that, you know, the question is who steps in to fill that vacuum. Well, China is a reluctant superpower. It doesn't necessarily, or it's not ready to step into that place. You've got other countries that seek to disrupt it, some of or players who seek to dismantle it because it hasn't worked in their favor and it doesn't serve their interests as well. The question, I think, for us on the continent is whether our institutions and our leaders are willing and ready and able and prepared to step in. Because you can't continue to play lip service to this notion of African solutions for African problems and not take the responsibility. You can't also insist that you have a seat at the table and not make sure it accompanies, you accompany that with a more responsible posture as well. But also, I would say one more final thing is that the conflicts that we're dealing with, whether it's the Sahel or the Great Lakes or Sudan, they're not primarily Africa's own responsibility. It's true that proximity matters and the region that's closest to it, the countries that are closest to it, are Africans, but these are international crises in nature and have significant global ramifications. You talked about peacekeeping, and for that reason, we cannot conclude with the suggestion that this is Africa's to take care of, because they do have grave internationalized consequences as well.
Prime Minister, I'm happy to align with the way Comfort is framing around the redefining of multilateralism. With that in mind, what does this redefining of multilateralism or rather, where does it leave African states? Where they think about, are they more vulnerable? Or does it mean that if they're freer to chart their own path? Particularly if you think about these various conflicts, when at the moment, if there's a retreat by the West, does that open an opportunity for us actively now to shape our own path?
You are right, but if we want to take advantage on this situation and to have a better place in the multilateral issues, we should unify Africa. The key word for Africa is unity. If you look at the vote in the United Nations, the last vote, for example, about Ukraine in the General Assembly, you see African country going in a different way. Some vote for, some against, some abstain. As long as we are on this kind of field, Africa will never have a great voice on the multilateral landscape. We have an opportunity now. Now it is an opportunity. But the key to get this opportunity done in our benefit is union. You should have one voice, and especially on the key issues, climate issue, reform of the United Nations issues. The key issue, Africa should speak with only one voice, and this is really a challenge.
I mean, I agree with you, Prime Minister, you know, that it's important that there's a sense of unity. I think it's difficult to get 54 countries and a system that's based on intergovernmentalism to speak with one voice. And Europe doesn't speak with one voice. I think we should acknowledge that. ASEAN also, because of the neighborhood that it finds itself in, cannot speak with one voice. I think what's key is that there's a clear strategic direction as well. I think what's key also is to make sure, for good example, is that when the African Union or regions call a summit, that you go to those summits as well, and that you pay your dues as well to what is seen by many people as a permanent multilateral organizations. And we always say, don't we, Prime Minister, that outsiders can't love our institutions more than we do. And there's a sense in which external actors pay more homage to the African Union than its member states. And I think is a real concern. Yeah.
Fortunately, we've had the part of the discussion I wanted us to have around the African Union, and particularly in light of the new leadership at the Commission. I think the kind of discussion we're having really means that we must have a much bigger discussion about what does this Commission need to do in order to have at least drive us towards the kind of unity we were discussing, the kind of very concerted and coordinated efforts as well. On this point, you'll remember, so that I transition into the next part, you'll remember there was a time in the AU when you had Obasanjo, Bouteflika, Mbeki, and others being able to speak with a very coherent and cohesive voice in order to at least marshal these 54 different nations in a particular direction. And that's the kind of thing that we must go back to. Where's the leadership at today? Let's talk solutions, the last set of questions. The AU's silencing of the guns initiative claims and aims to end conflict by 2030. But cuts to development aid really will widen this gap increasingly. Dr. Ero, what's the one bold step, whether it's local, regional, or international, that could shift the needle toward peace in Africa's forgotten conflicts?
Look, I think you put your nail in it when you're defining the evolution of the African Union and the glorious era that you were pointing to in the early 2000s. You know, you talked about Obasanjo and Bouteflika, but also your president and Mbeki as well. And it's that concerted effort that we are taking this seriously, and that we are going to implement our own constitutive act. If the constitutive act of the African Union was fully implemented, it would be a very different moment as well. It was one that shifted from non-indifference, from non-interference, to wanting to take seriously and ensure never again as well. Now that momentum has gone, and it goes back to what you were saying, Prime Minister, that the need to cohere and to take seriously and not just pay lip service to the idea of preventative diplomacy, which the Union was doing very seriously at one point, and it seems to have gone by the wayside.
Prime Minister, let me give you the last word. What does the African Union or member states, what do they need to do to break the cycle of violence that we keep seeing across the continent?
I will end by one word: leadership. If you look at Africa, we are 54. But the key countries should take the leadership. The North, Egypt. West, Nigeria. South, South Africa. Central parts, we have to discuss.
I was waiting to see what
Eastern part also, maybe Ethiopia or
even some
Kenya.
of those North African countries may dispute your
Yes,
choice.
absolutely, absolutely. But 5, 6, or 7 countries, if they are together, to put their strength together, they will find a way to drive the others following them. And especially Nigeria.
Yes.
I am really sad when I look at Nigeria totally focused on his own feet.
Correct.
Instead of taking the leadership in West Africa, even in Africa. We have to work on that and to fight to get the golden era, to come back to the golden era with a real leadership.
As a child of Nigeria, I can only agree with your statement.
Prime Minister Mara, Dr. Comfort Ero, thank you very much for joining us at this Raisina Ideas Pod. What's very clear to all of us that addressing Africa's complex conflicts requires strong leadership from the continent, great international action, and renewed commitment to multilateralism. The conversation continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Ideas Pod. In this session, we are going to be discussing about a region that's been the driver of global growth for a long period of time. Talking about Southeast Asia, countries like Philippines, Thailand, and Singapore. Now, these countries are formerly known as the ASEAN countries, and they have a particular way of doing diplomacy as well as engaging with the rest of the world. But how does that engagement change in this increasingly polarized world? You've got the Americans on one side, the Chinese, the Russians. So what does that mean for the ASEAN way of doing things in this world? And that's what we're going to be discussing in this session. Let me introduce the guests first. Joining me is Enrique Manalo, who's the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, and Mr. Marid Sangyamphong, who's the Foreign Minister of Thailand. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the Ideas Pod. Let me first, just to set things up, ask you this. What is the ASEAN way of doing diplomacy and engaging with the world? How would you describe it, Minister?
Well, I think the ASEAN way is through cooperation with all countries and those who wish to cooperate with ASEAN. We have also the ASEAN way in the sense of reaching decisions by consensus. But I think most importantly, the ASEAN way is to try and bring together all the parties in our region, not only the ASEAN members, but the other countries who are not members of ASEAN, and that's through the concept of ASEAN centrality, especially through the institutions of ASEAN, where we have a number of institutions such as the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, where ASEAN, as chair, convenes meetings and invites all the major countries in our region, including those outside of our region, the EU, the United States. And these are the forums where they all meet to discuss issues of regional and even global import. So that way, the ASEAN is a kind of convener and facilitator, as well as an institution aimed at, or a grouping aimed at improving the lives of its members too, through economic, social, and political measures.
There's a very important word you mentioned right now, which is consensus. And that seems to be very hard in the world right now. The major powers can't agree on anything. So how do you project that ASEAN way of consensus into this polarized world? Minister?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to understand the histories of ASEAN. In fact, ASEAN have gone through all of these problems during particularly the times when we established our ASEAN 58 years ago during the Cold War periods. And, we established a very good collaborations, as Manaro said. The concept is that we try to avoid the taking side. That is one way. And the ASEAN ways that you mentioned, it's difficult to make a consensus. We have the concept. If you look at the countries in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, we are the only regional grouping that's composed of several, and in fact it's different in political ideologies. We have capitalists, we have socialists, and then we have absolute monarchy. So we experience all of these things, even though we are different. We don't want everyone to look the same, act the same, and think the same. I like to say it in every occasion that we are the very special countries, member countries, that can see the beauty of differences. And that becomes understanding that instead of trying to push someone to act, to think, to work, to talk the same, we try to highlight some things, which is the differences that we have. But if you look at the histories of ASEAN become, the strength of ASEAN is because we are different. And so to achieve the consensus is not difficult and not easy. I think if we understand each other, if we understand the situations, if we understand the history backgrounds, that we are different, then the achievement of the consensus might not be a problem.
Yeah. And something that the world is struggling right now with is taking sides. We've always said that if countries do not take sides as much, maybe it would be a better place right now. But then again, you look at the sort of wars in the world right now, you look at people being killed, and then it becomes a moral question as well. You as a country have a responsibility to take the side of the good. At the same time, you want global peace at the end of the day. So how do you balance those two, let's say, opposing forces? Yes, sir, you can go ahead.
Well, I think what really the ASEAN way of dealing that is first to focus on ASEAN's own objectives, how to improve the lives of our people, how to strengthen the ASEAN community, and how to enhance integration among the ASEAN member states. But I think the bigger picture here is that the ASEAN countries, who are essentially middle power countries in our region, I think we have realized that we should be the makers of our own destiny, and that we shouldn't let the future of our region be determined by one side or a big power or the big powers. We have a duty to ourselves and our people to ensure that we also have a say in how our region develops. And that's how we move forward. We have our own identity, and we deal with the powers in that way by asserting the ASEAN view as much as possible. Because we are in this region, we will be here forever probably, and so it's really our duty as let's say government officials and as policymakers to ensure that our countries are developed enough to really have a future say, or a say even now in the present, on how our region develops, the ASEAN region, even the wider Indo-Pacific region, and eventually even on global issues of concern to us, such as climate change, health security, etc. So we are doing our way by trying to assert to the best of our ability our voice in regional and global affairs.
Yeah.
If I may add,
Yeah, please do.
when you said that once there are difficulties or confrontations between, don't want to say anyone, but if you have a kind of confrontations, then the way of the ASEAN that we act together is a constructive dialogue. The dialogue is the only way to solve the problem, because if you have a confrontations and then you try to take sides and then try to accumulate, the support of, a lot of countries in the areas of arms, and there will be, no ways that you can find a solution. So constructive dialogue is the most important things, and that becomes the principle of ASEAN. If you may be well aware, we have around 1,000 meetings among ASEAN members, but that is the way that ASEAN is doing things together, constructive dialogue.
And when you try to convince your colleagues in maybe China or in the West that consensus building is the way to go, what sort of response do you usually get from them, Minister?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to realize that ASEAN's main strength, at least with the other countries in the region, is our power of convening meetings and also facilitating the meetings. I said earlier that, for example, our institutions like the East Asia Summit attracts almost every country in the region, even extra-regional countries. And the issues we discuss are issues of concern to all of us. And the idea is to try and bring the dialogue together. So we don't really think that we'll be able to solve the problems at those meetings. But the thing is for countries to exchange their views so we develop a better understanding. We'll build on that in the future, because our aim is really to promote dialogue and try and see we can facilitate the meeting of minds. And that's where the power of ASEAN lies, in the sense that we're the only institution that has the ability to attract the participation of major powers and even the middle powers in our region, and as I said, even outside the region, from EU, from Western countries as well, plus our own dialogue partners. We have many mechanisms of dealing with other countries too. So that's where, that's our role, to see how we can have the dialogue.
And when Secretary Monaro mentions about the East Asia Summit, ASEAN also established several mechanisms, things like ASEAN Regional Forum. It's one of the most effective forums, and it is the only international forum where North Korea sits at the same table with all stakeholders like South Korea, US, Japan, and United States. So the constructive dialogue, if we select the issues or the themes, the agenda according to our needs, try to solve it, or try to make a durable solutions, then we can, get something. I fully agree that we cannot solve 100% all the problems, but this is the efforts, and it is the way that ASEAN is practiced for the long period of time. And it works for ASEAN, might as well work for any other regions.
Well, I could just add to that. For example, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, we now have over 50 countries who have acceded, especially in recent years, quite a number. So I think many, many countries, even from other regions, are seeing the value of ASEAN and working with ASEAN to promote greater cooperation and dialogue. So I think that's, to me, an excellent sign of the growing relevance, in fact, of ASEAN and recognition of the contributions we can make towards peace and stability, as well as economic development and growth.
Right. I'd also like to focus a bit on where the Southeast Asian region is placed, because economically a lot of countries in the region are dependent on China for trade. Most of your countries, China is the biggest trading partner. But then historically you look at the security part of things, and the US has provided weapons and security guarantees and things like that. So how do you bring the ASEAN way into a situation where you have a belligerent neighbor who you're also financially dependent on, and then a distant power who's been your security guarantor but is now rolling back those commitments under Donald Trump? You can go ahead, sir.
Well, I'd like to highlight the way that ASEAN and the histories of ASEAN as we go out together. You know, when the establishment of ASEAN, if you look at the histories of ASEAN's established on the political motivations, means that the politicals and security is the incentive for ASEAN's 5 founding member countries, including Philippines and Thailand, which came into the tables and then established ASEAN. But once we understand that in this real world, the economic development is much more important, so we change the mindsets of securities into the collaborations in economic development, and we divert the ideas of changing the battlefield into a marketplace, and then that ASEAN becomes the major trading partner, not only China. Of course, China is very important for ASEAN, and in fact, China is important to every country in this world. So right now, member of ASEAN become the major trading partner and investor for each and every one of ASEAN. So that is very proud of ASEAN. Of course, we depend also on the economic developments with China, but a lot more that we are doing together among ASEAN is one of the enormous achievements that we have made. And the security, ASEAN is also working together in that areas. Now, ASEAN becomes more and more collaborate in the areas of securities and everything together. And if you take the clip from Mr. He's the former permanent secretary of Singapore. He said that if you want to learn how to live in peace, you come to ASEAN and then you learn from us.
Mr. Mendel, I think you'll be better placed to answer this, because we're seeing headlines almost every day now about clashes between the Chinese and the Philippines and the open seas. And how is Philippines balancing those economic relations with China? And then you obviously are a treaty ally of the United States. How does that work out?
Well, we have said on many occasions, of course, we have extensive relations with China, especially on the economic front, and of course with the United States also as a treaty ally. And we are dealing with both of them in a way that we try and enhance our interests. Of course, we have tensions in the South China Sea. And those are tensions, I think, which have been there, especially recently, and has led to a number of incidents. But we have always been committed to dealing with these tensions or incidents through management, through diplomatic or peaceful means, and we're still committed to that. And of course, we are doing everything in our ability to ensure that we try and follow this track. But of course, we've made perfectly clear that while we're committed to peaceful or diplomatic solutions, it would not be at the expense of our interests as far as the South China Sea is concerned. With the United States, of course, we have a treaty, and we've had strong historical relations with them, either in the economic or the security front. And at the moment, it's from our conversations with U.S. officials, I think I can only say that we have a great optimism that this relationship will continue. That being said, of course, we're also committed to discussing with China on how we can manage the tensions in the South China Sea. So those are the approaches. But at the same time, we're also dealing with other partners.
Just to follow up on that,
Yeah.
when President Donald Trump goes out in the Oval Office and says, you know what, if NATO countries don't pay up, we're not going to defend you. What goes on in the mind of officials in Manila? What is your reaction to statements like that?
Well, I can only say our reactions are reactions to what we have discussed with U.S. officials in the current administration. And I can say at this point that it gives great hope and optimism that our relationship will not only remain stable, but could increase in the future.
Mr. Let's also talk about those middle powers, your likes of India, for example. What role does ASEAN see for countries like India when it comes to bridging those polarized divisions in the world? How can ASEAN combine with India to create consensus in the world?
Well, I think the most important is that India is also our dialogue partner of ASEAN, and several things that we can do with India. In fact, in this, the geopolitics is not just the issues of politics and security, but there's also the opportunities for geoeconomics as well. So I think, the ASEAN way, we look for something very, constructive, not just, conflict. And working with India is very important because ASEAN and India can collaborate in several areas. And look at ASEAN. In fact, we are the center of connectivity for India and countries in South Asia to connect with ASEAN and ASEAN Plus. When I said ASEAN Plus, is plus China, Japan, and Korea. And through the hub of connectivities and the principle of being peacefully together, I think ASEAN and India can make a lot more for progressing the prosperities in the regions of South Asia and Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia plus China and Japan and Korea.
Would you like to add to that?
Yes, I could. Well, first of all, the Philippines is now the ASEAN-India coordinator. And we already have a lot on our plate. We have a lot of activities being planned. We'll be for the next 3 years during our coordinatorship, because India is definitely a very valuable partner for individual ASEAN countries as well as ASEAN as a whole. And I think if you look at the broader picture, India's Indo-Pacific strategy, which is now gaining much greater shape and participation of India, especially in our region, and the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, a document we adopted some years ago, practically coincide, especially on the main values that we have is of ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific, ensuring greater prosperity for our peoples. So I think, and of course, commitments to international law and a rules-based order. So I think these basic values provide the basis for really a strong relationship, whether it be on the economic front or cultural front. So India is obviously a very important partner for ASEAN as well as the individual ASEAN countries.
I'd also like to bring your focus on something that the ASEAN way has not managed to solve so far, and that's the situation in Myanmar. It's been, I think, more than almost 5 years now, and the military junta still maintains a grip on power, and the transition to democracy is not happening. And now there's a civil war and fighting every day between the junta as well as the rebel forces. What is the ASEAN way forward in Myanmar?
Well, when you mentioned about the civil wars going on, in fact, there's no civil war in Myanmar. And of course, situations in Myanmar is very important for ASEAN. And what we are trying to do, particularly Thailand as the immediate neighbor of Myanmar, what we are trying to do, the best is now trying to change the mindsets of the people. First of all, you have to understand the situations, the histories of Myanmar. And, it is the internal, difficulties that they have. We don't want to interfere into, the directions of the countries of Myanmar. We have one of the principles of ASEAN is the non-interference, which still, works. And we want Myanmar to solve its own problems. It must be Myanmar-led, Myanmar-owned. And 5-point consensus of ASEAN still remains the same as the principle of doing things together in Myanmar. But on top of that, we are trying to change the mindsets of the people, any stakeholders who who are part of the difficulties. We would like to change the mindsets of all of them from, the sense of conflicts into collaborations. In fact, the fighting against the call center or scammer is a very good, collaborations between Thailand and the neighboring country. ASEAN support Thailand's doing that, and have to thank to India because at that time I organized the three-party meetings last May, if I'm not mistaken, here in New Delhi when India hosts the BIMSTEC retreat, and then we organized the three-party meetings, Thailand, Myanmar, and India, to change the mindset, to try to focus on collaborations. And it yields a very good result. At the end of last month, we can, solve problems of scammer and also the call center, and 500 India, they are flying back home safely. Well, there's a lot more that we still working together, and that is to show to you that the collaborations between Thailand, Myanmar, and all stakeholders of Myanmar in this particular issue working very well.
Just on that point of non-interference in a fellow ASEAN state, we've seen reports of alleged American weapons flowing into Myanmar. We've heard about the Chinese involvement in Myanmar. So we've even seen the junta chiefs visiting Moscow and talking to President Putin and all of that. So when you see all these other major players heavily involved in Myanmar, how does ASEAN manage to still stick to the policy of non-interference? Is there a tendency somewhere to sort of say, if they're interfering, shouldn't we protect our interests as well? Minister?
Well, first let me say that the basic framework of ASEAN's approach to Myanmar is the 5-point consensus, and we still remain committed to that. And that includes a number of elements which are essentially aimed at trying to get the stakeholders to meet and discuss. Second point is humanitarian assistance, where ASEAN has contributed to that. And more or less that has been the situation the past few years. But we have to recognize that ultimately any solution to the problem in Myanmar has to be Myanmar-led. The people have to do it. What ASEAN can do using the 5-point consensus as a framework is to try and see how we can create conditions for dialogue. No one is saying this can happen overnight. In fact, many countries in ASEAN, especially, for example, my colleague in Thailand, have tried to also arrange through activities to involve some of the stakeholders. And this kind of activities are being encouraged by ASEAN. But I think what we're really trying to impress is that in order to have lasting peace, in order to have stability, the people of Myanmar have to be the ones. Now, to reach any kind of solution, what we can do is to try and encourage them and nudge them forward. We're willing to work even with other countries, provided they're within the context of the 5-point consensus, and ASEAN coordinates with them too, if possible. So that's been our approach. It will continue to be our approach. Also with the UN, we work with them too. So really, this is a kind of situation where you really have to rely on the internal forces to be the eventual solution.
Well, I think strategy and geopolitics aside, I think we can all agree that consensus and taking everyone along is something that every country in the world should be striving to do. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for this interesting chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod. My name is Luka Nyonyer, Chief Operating Officer of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation in South Africa. Joining me today are two exceptional voices, Dr. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, Prime Minister Moussa Mara, former Prime Minister of Mali. Welcome to you both. Let's dive in.
Thank you.
The international system as we know it is fraying at its edges. Africa once again finds itself at the intersection of competition between global and regional powers, seeking strategic advantages in essential minerals and resources. Against this backdrop, violent conflicts persist in regions like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Gulf and the Great Lakes. Conflicts that receive limited attention internationally, yet carry profound implications not just for the African continent and its stability, but for global peace and global stability as well. Comfort, I'll start with you. The Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and the Great Lakes are distinct in their histories, yet they share a common thread of external interference and weak state capacity. Which of these regions do you see as the most urgent flashpoint right now?
They're all urgent, quite frankly. I mean, given the scale of human suffering, the transnational nature of the conflicts, these are effectively internationalized civil wars. And I want to go back to what you said at the opening about where Africa as a continent is located in the international sort of geopolitical landscape. And what is very clear to us is that unlike 20 years ago, for example, where Sudan was at the top of the agenda, these conflicts are deprioritized. It's clear also that regions also have to start taking care of themselves first, because the usual the usual arbiters of these conflicts, Washington, London, Paris, are no longer have the bandwidth to take care of these crises. And the multilateral architecture that we have on the continent, both in the apex of the African Union or regional bodies, really need to start taking seriously conflict resolution in all its scales, whether it's averting, de-escalating, or actually managing the conflicts as well. Because these are three quite seismic conflicts in three of Africa's, out of the 5 regions on the continent, 3 of them are in crisis. And we cannot overstate how severe the situation is today.
And why do we keep missing the warning signs? These are conflicts that keep restarting and over and over.
It's not about the warning signs, it's about political will. It's about deciding that these are crises that you need to deal with straight away rather than rush into peacekeeping. It's the art of peacemaking and preventative diplomacy. All the regional architectures, and I'm going to single out ECOWAS, the West Africa one, because it is the poster child of everything that we're seeing around the continent. It was the one that took the novel decision, you'll remember, Prime Minister, took the novel decision of saying that for us to really deal with economic integration, we have to deal with security first. And what we're seeing right now is a reversal of fortunes in that architecture that ECOWAS built around peace and security as well. So I think what worries me also is that most of the time these instruments, the multilateral nature of these bodies on the continent itself is in trouble, is in crisis, and is not able to respond in time, even though they've got all the information at their fingertips as well.
Prime Minister, the Sahel region continues to witness these unconstitutional transfers of power and violent extremism, yet global responses remain inconsistent. Even continental responses are inconsistent as well. Why does the Sahel remain misunderstood, and what kind of global action is required to get a hand of what's happening at the moment?
I don't think Sahel is misunderstood. I think we have some huge crises over the world, and the challenge in Sahel is not squared for the global players, and that's why we look like maybe put aside of the different light in the international landscape. In this case, in this environment, we have to try to find the solution on our own, by ourselves. And the regional body, like ECOWAS and the African Union, they have a huge challenge to find the right way to solve the African problem. This is a great deal, but it is not impossible. It is not impossible. The first is the political will. The second is our ability to organize ourselves, to put our strength together, and to deal with the root causes of what we face. And as I regularly say, the problem in our country is not a question of international player. It is a question of internal weakness. The failure of our states and the inability of our states to find the answer to the question posed by the societies. We have to deal with, and I am sure it is possible.
Two-part follow-up, Prime Minister. The leaders themselves, particularly the military leaders, do you see them showing the kind of political will. You're suggesting one. Secondly, ECOWAS has also been very inconsistent. At one part they're suspending, at the next part they're withdrawing the suspension. The countries have now left or are leaving ECOWAS. What's the state of political will at the moment?
The problem of the militaries is they are not fit to lead the country, seriously, profoundly. And they do not understand the substance of our countries and our crises. They answer military by using force, by using weapons. This is the only thing they know, and this is the only way they will go. And it is not enough to solve this kind of problem by only military ways. This is the problem of the militaries. That's why we have to talk to them and to try to convince them, even to put a pressure on them by using the society means, the civil society organization, in order to obtain their withdrawal from the leadership. This is what we have to do. They are not able to find the right solution to Sahelian and other parts of Africa.
Prime Minister, I know, and I'm agreed with you, that the external actors aren't as significant as the media and outsiders seem to think. But let's look at them briefly. The state of the world at the moment is really being driven by this idea of mineral diplomacy that you see primarily out of the US at the moment, but has really been driven by the Chinese and middle powers equally over the last number of years as well. From your perspective, how do these external interests and ambitions for resources shape or influence the kind of conflicts you're seeing across the continent, but also in the Sahel in particular as well?
I am sure if the state is weak, if the state is not solid institution, this kind of external impact will be huge. And even on this way, we need to build a solid institution, democratic ones, a state able to solve its own problem. That will ease the mineral deal if it comes to a question of deal. I am not against the deal. I think we should focus on our interests and work with whoever wants to work with us. If we can solve the problem by making some deal about the resources, yes. But the substance should be state, strength of state, strength of our institution, and our ability to understand our interests, short-term, middle-term, and the long-term interests.
Dr. Comfort, let me bring you in here. This idea of this new scramble for the continent is really interesting when you think about the initial scramble in the late 1800s. What's the risk that this scramble turns dormant conflicts into active proxy wars? And where do you see that playing out most tangibly at the moment?
When hasn't there been a scramble for resources on the continent?
But doesn't it feel more acute at the moment, in the same way you're saying in the bigger discussion?
We were saying 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's been a scramble for resources. When I look back to when I started sort of, working across the continent, one of the first two conflicts, or three conflicts that I was engaged in, Angola, Sierra Leone and Liberia. And what was the heart of the matter? Diamonds and timber. So these were drivers and things that fueled conflict both internally, when the distribution of the cake is not large enough so that everybody can eat from the cake, and also because of external factors. But it goes back to what you were saying, Prime Minister, as well. When you don't have a consolidation of the state, when you don't have key principles, when you don't have the governance structure, the economic governance structure, so that you ensure that the revenue that's collected is used wisely across the country to enable people, then you fuel grievance, you fuel illicit activities as well. But you're also right to acknowledge the resource dimension of conflicts. I mean, look at what's happening in the Great Lakes now. So President Tshisekedi looks with interest with the mineral diplomacy that you talked about in Ukraine and says, well, America, come and buy my minerals, because what do we have? We're the richest country when it comes to copper and cobalt, which is used for a lot of the telephones that we're using. Europe's interest, among other things, in the Democratic Republic of Congo today is access to those minerals, access to using these materials, because they're very important back to their industries as well. China is playing a very long game as well in setting up its stall in these countries. One of the reasons why also we're seeing this rush to annex the eastern part of Congo also is not just because of national interest tied to Rwanda's long-standing national security concerns, but it's also an interest in access to those raw materials as well. So there are external forces at play as well, but they also intersect with the fact that you've got a very weak center of gravity that doesn't have a good governance architecture to address those needs. So those two things do collide in the way the Prime Minister was suggesting.
Let's look at just briefly at the global order, and then we'll come back to the continent. Comfort, when the US withdraws from the global order, at least appears to be withdrawing, the West is going to become increasingly distracted, as I think we were seeing in the panel you were both on. The entire discussion around waging peace was largely focused on Europe and the Middle East. So we must imagine that the West is going to be distracted. How does the vacuum affect peacekeeping and conflict mediation on the continent? What do you anticipate might happen increasingly?
Let me say one thing about this notion that the United States is withdrawing. I don't think it's withdrawing. I think it's redefining its own relationship with a number of countries and a number of regions as well. I think it also wants to negotiate the terms of its continuing engagement. And I mean, well, if you put yourself in the position of President Trump, he feels as that there have been free riders. In fact, it was President Obama who talked about the freeloading as free riders as well. So this is a United States that wants to negotiate the terms of the very structure that it created as well, which it has benefited it as well. And you're right, you're also right, and I think this is what's very worrying for the continent, is that because other countries, your traditional allies themselves are distracted, they've got other priorities as well. You're right that, you know, the question is who steps in to fill that vacuum. Well, China is a reluctant superpower. It doesn't necessarily, or it's not ready to step into that place. You've got other countries that seek to disrupt it, some of or players who seek to dismantle it because it hasn't worked in their favor and it doesn't serve their interests as well. The question, I think, for us on the continent is whether our institutions and our leaders are willing and ready and able and prepared to step in. Because you can't continue to play lip service to this notion of African solutions for African problems and not take the responsibility. You can't also insist that you have a seat at the table and not make sure it accompanies, you accompany that with a more responsible posture as well. But also, I would say one more final thing is that the conflicts that we're dealing with, whether it's the Sahel or the Great Lakes or Sudan, they're not primarily Africa's own responsibility. It's true that proximity matters and the region that's closest to it, the countries that are closest to it, are Africans, but these are international crises in nature and have significant global ramifications. You talked about peacekeeping, and for that reason we cannot conclude with the suggestion that this is Africa's to take care of, because they do have grave internationalized consequences as well.
Prime Minister, I'm happy to align with the way Comfort is framing around the redefining of multilateralism. With that in mind, what does this redefining of multilateralism, or rather, where does it leave African states? Where they think about, are they more vulnerable, or does it mean that if they're freer to chart their own path? Particularly if you think about these various conflicts, when at the moment, if there's a retreat by the West, does that open an opportunity for us actively now to shape our own path?
You are right, but if we want to take advantage on this situation, and to have a better place in the multilateral issues, we should unify Africa.
Sure.
The key word for Africa is unity. If you look at the vote in the United Nations, the last vote, for example, about Ukraine in the General Assembly, you see African country going in a different way. Some vote for, some against, some abstain. As long as we are on this kind of field, Africa will never have a great voice on the multilateral landscape. We have an opportunity now. Now it is an opportunity. But the key to get this opportunity done in our benefit is union. You should have one voice, and especially on the key issues, climate issue, reform of the United Nations issues. The key issue, Africa should speak with only one voice, and this is really a challenge.
I mean, I agree with you, Prime Minister, you know, that it's important that there's a sense of unity. I think it's difficult to get 54 countries and a system that's based on intergovernmentalism to speak with one voice. And Europe doesn't speak with one voice. I think we should acknowledge that. ASEAN also, because of the neighborhood that it finds itself in, cannot speak with one voice. I think what's key is that there's a clear strategic direction as well. I think what's key also is to make sure, for good example, is that when the African Union or regions call a summit, that you go to those summits as well, and that you pay your dues as well to what is seen by many people as a permanent multilateral organizations. And we always say, don't we, Prime Minister, that outsiders can't love our institutions more than we do. And there's a sense in which external actors pay more homage to the African Union than its member states. And I think is a real concern. Yeah.
Fortunately, we've had that part of the discussion I wanted us to have around the African Union, and particularly in light of the new leadership at the Commission. I think the kind of discussion we're having really means that we must have a much bigger discussion about what does this Commission need to do in order to have at least drive us towards the kind of unity we were discussing, the kind of very concerted and coordinated effort as well. On this point, you'll remember, so that I transition into the next part, you'll remember there was a time in the AU when you had Obasanjo, Bouteflika, Mbeki, and others being able to speak with a very coherent and cohesive voice in order to at least marshal these 54 different nations in a particular direction. And that's the kind of thing that we must go back to. Where's the leadership at today? Let's talk solutions, the last set of questions. The AU's silencing of the guns initiative claims and aims to end conflict by 2030. But cuts to development aid really will widen this gap increasingly. Dr. Ero, what's the one bold step, whether it's local, regional, or international, that could shift the needle toward peace in Africa's forgotten conflicts?
Look, I think you put your nail in it when you're defining the evolution of the African Union and the glorious era that you were pointing to in the early 2000s. You know, you talked about Obasanjo and particular, but also your president and Mbeki as well. And it's that concerted effort that we are taking this seriously, and that we are going to implement our own constitutive act. If the constitutive act of the African Union was fully implemented, it would be a very different moment as well. It was one that shifted from non-indifference, from non-interference, to wanting to take seriously and ensure never again as well. Now that momentum has gone, and it goes back to what you were saying, Prime Minister, that the need to cohere and to take seriously and not just pay lip service to the idea of preventative diplomacy, which the Union was doing very seriously at one point, and it seems to have gone by the wayside.
Right, Mr. McGiffey, the last word. What does the African Union or member states, what do they need to do to break the cycle of violence that we keep seeing across the continent?
I will end by one word: leadership. If you look at Africa, we are 54. But the key countries should take the leadership. The North, Egypt. West, Nigeria. South, South Africa. Central parts, we have to discuss.
I was waiting to see what
Eastern part also, maybe Ethiopia or
Even some
Kenya.
of those North African countries may dispute your
Yes,
choice.
absolutely, absolutely. But 5, 6, or 7 countries, if they are together, to put their strength together, they will find a way to drive the others following them. And especially Nigeria.
Yes.
I am really sad when I look at Nigeria totally focused on his own feet.
Correct.
Instead of taking the leadership in West Africa, even in Africa. We have to work on that and to fight to get the golden era, to come back to the golden era with a real leadership.
As a child of Nigeria, I can only agree with your statement.
Prime Minister Mara, Dr. Comfort Ero, thank you very much for joining us at this Raisina Ideas Pod. What's very clear to all of us that addressing Africa's complex conflicts requires strong leadership from the continent, great international action, and renewed commitment to multilateralism. The conversation continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Ideas Pod, Raisina 2025, which we are doing with the Firstpost. And with me today is our special guest, Excellency Xavier Bettel, the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Luxembourg is this beautiful small country, population 627,000 or somewhere around that, and half the population of this great country is international. It is a truly globalized country. And you, I think, of course, the strength has been the financial sector, integrated banking. That's what really helped you. Can I ask you about, what does Luxembourg feel about position Luxembourg? What do you feel? You are an international society. What do you feel about the retreat of globalization, which is happening, and then post that, the rift which is appearing across the transatlantic, which is a deep divide, shattering the entire concept of globalization? Do you feel threatened?
The first thing, when you did the presentation of my country, you said banks, but you have to know that my country, the first success was steel. In fact, we discovered steel, and we had glorious years with the steel industry, but then we realized that steel won't be forever. So we did financial services, but we did also satellites with Astra, one of the biggest satellite company in the world. We did it with also broadcasting and also the radio. RTL, which is one of the most famous European radio, the L is for Luxembourg, and we were also, now we are active in space mining, where we even work together with India. So we were always able to be first movers in a lot of topics, also with the finances, with green bonds, and all these climate goals and products that we are able to link to finances to makes this success.
And wasn't it that Benelux kind of seeded the idea of the European Union?
Yes, the Benelux was before the European Union, but in fact, my country, because we spoke about multilateral, you spoke about globalization.
Yeah.
And the fact is, I prefer to speak about multilateralism, because globalization sounds like one world with one big thing. By multilateralism, it's that you work with other partners together, and it's not one, it's partners. So my country success is the multilateralism, because in the 19th century, a lot of Luxembourgers had to leave to migrate to the States because they were not able to have enough food, because we were an agriculture country before having this success story of the steel. And as you said also, 50% of the country are non-Luxembourgers. Yeah. And you said international. I like that, because in some countries they would say they are foreigners. We don't speak about foreigners. We speak about people living with us, but with an other citizenship or with an international citizenship. And so what is the success of this country? It's even with 50%. When I see that in some countries, some party who makes diversity a weakness of the society, we believe that diversity is our strength. So you said the multilateralism. Yes, multilateralism it's difficult because we see the UN is not working, we say that the international trade is not working, and we see that even the international agencies are in a situation now where we don't know how long they will be able to continue to work. So we have for the moment a crisis of the multilateralism, that's a fact. But I don't like the word globalization because then I will already have people who will hate.
The fashionable world is being chased on Twitter, and globalists are not very much liked these days.
So let's speak about multilateralism. No, so this is a success.
Why I spoke about globalization.
This is the success. And for example, now with the trade agreement we want with India, it's also when you speak about trade agreements and fair trade, it's an opportunity. And people just see bad things because populists will just point out and to say that everything is bad. And we need to defend it. So I'm a defender of multilateralism. I'm a defender of having partners where it's not a win-lose situation, but a win-win situation. And with India, for example, we work a lot together on space, on health issues. But we could have more. I think you are the 36th or 37th trade partner of Luxembourg. And that's the reason why I was happy to be here and to have new contacts also.
That's why we are happy to have you here.
Yeah, that's usually what you say when you invite me, but when I'm leaving, you are even more happy usually.
No, we'll not be happy. We'll get you back for Raisina time and time again.
Thank you for the invitation.
But we are worried about what's happening in Europe. And there are issues like, if you'd like to talk about the Draghi report and the future, the Draghi report also talks about some measures which will seem to be necessary, but there's a lot of opposition about them, particularly the ones related to the financial architecture, about unitary finance, making it one kind of more integrated banking system, one integrated financial system, and there seems a lot of pushback against it. Now, in this context, when Europe is also facing some headwinds, certainly from what is incidents across the Atlantic. I don't know if there's a stable, unstable, whatever it is. So in this situation, the kind of recommendations which have come on a better financial system for Europe at large, and which of course is a lot of the times with a country like Luxembourg really think that is the way to go on, that is which is the future. But when that kind of pushback starts coming and you other times see what is happening across the Atlantic, is this going to be more difficult now? Or is this a challenge which needs to be taken up?
So it's a large question, but the fact is we need in fact to find the right balance between regulation and innovation. Also in finances. Yeah. If we have over-regulation, we are not attractive. I remember when we had the discussions about the Tobin tax. That was something where we said, should we have this special tax in Europe or not? We should also think as European continent. Is it in our interest that the financial places in Europe are weaker than London, which is not anymore the European Union, or that investors prefer to go to Hong Kong, to Dubai, to Singapore, or to London or Switzerland, instead of coming to the European Union. So we need always to find the right balance, and we should avoid over-regulation. And that's also the problem. Very often, we especially in financial sector, with the ESMA and others, we want to have regulations on regulations. And so this is also, and we have the last report also about this, the regulations in Europe, that it harms, in fact, the economy to have over-regulation. So it is important to have rules. It is important to have level playing fields. And but it's also important to think that the European continent should be competitive. When you speak about tax, usually when you speak about tax, it's just to raise. I never heard that we want to lower them altogether. It's always a raise. And I think it's important to keep that in a global world. And when we see the actors, and I just had a panel where we discussed, when we see, for example, in the AI sector, you have to choose for the moment between China or the United States. When you see your phone, you choose between Korean or Chinese or Americans. When you see Google or all these platforms, it's American. So where are the Europeans? So over-regulation is killing also innovation, and we need to find the right balance to innovate, but to regulate also. And when we had the GDPR, so the data protection rules, at the beginning everybody said, ooh, boo, 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 boo. And now it's a standard. So we need to not over-regulate, but to have regulations because we need to protect also people, but still being attractive.
So GDPR is one area of contest which has arisen between the US and Europe. The other is now the Global Tax Treaty, which is the digital tax treaty, which the US is not very happy with, and they seem to withdrawn from it. So what do you think about those things?
I think, again, if the tax treaty means that everybody has to raise taxes because some others are too high and they still want to be competitive, I never heard that we want to go down on taxes.
No, it's not about raising taxes. It's saying that your minimum, the lowest tax, there is the baseline.
Yeah, I know this, but usually,
compete with each other.
But usually, it's never to get down with taxes. All the regulations that we have with taxes are usually to higher them because other countries are higher with them. I think it is important. I fully believe if all, especially on taxations, we should have what we have in the OCDE, so a larger, a world rule. I have no problems with world rules, but I don't want that the European continent is afterwards weaker compared to America, to Asia, to other or non-EU countries in Europe. We need to have level playing fields which are the same for everyone. There I fully agree. But if it's just to say that we want to have rules just for us, why should we punish ourselves and making us less competitive compared to other countries because then we think we would sleep better? No, we should be competitive, and competitiveness is also taxation. It's a fact, we see it.
Yeah, tax competition is also about lowering the taxes and,
but not only,
creating data
we
habits.
can limit. The fact is nowadays we need to, we have because we have a taxation dumping. So some people want really to go down, and this is difficult. How do you want to explain to your citizens when they have to pay taxes that other people are not paying taxes? First thing. The second thing is we have labor dumping also. We have rules in some countries where children and where really the salaries are so low that we have a labor. And then we have an environmental dumping. We have a climate dumping because in some we have strict rules on production, and this is nowadays you see that even some countries want to ease the rules because they say then we are less competitive. But that's the reason why we need international rules, where we say that these rules are okay for all the member countries. And we should, as European Union, push that we have like the climate agreement in Paris. I was there for the climate agreement in Paris as a prime minister. We took this promise, and it's not for us, it's for the next generations. And I remember just afterwards I visited China, and when the first term of Donald Trump, he decided to resign from the Paris Agreement, you could have a domino effect of all the countries saying we leave, we leave, we leave, we leave. But this is also what the legacy we will leave to the next generation. So it is not only fiscal, it's also labor, it's climate, and I could continue the list of all these different criteria which are important.
And data.
Data is important too, but data is important. We know that data is a bit the fuel of tomorrow. I should say electricity because we have to drive electrical more. So
China has developed deep sea.
But it's the economy. It's the economy. It's the economy of tomorrow, and we all produce data. So that's the reason, for example, why in Luxembourg we created Tier 4, which are the most safest data. But we also created something you never heard, I'm sure, about it, what we call the data embassy. So that means, for example, when you have your data in a country where there is a threat from cyber attacks or from attacks from another country, you have in Luxembourg the possibility to have a data embassy where you can have a backup of all the data of your population, so that if there is an attack in your country or on your hard disk, if I would say, of your sovereign hard disk, that you have a backup in Luxembourg. With all the sovereignty rights and diplomatic rights from the Vienna Convention, this is something when I was Prime Minister I did in charge also of digitalization, and I'm very happy that we are able to innovate, but the digital is the energy of tomorrow, and we should also explain to people, because when you speak digital, you have to speak also about the AI and about these social impacts, because some jobs are not created yet, will be created tomorrow, but some jobs will disappear. It's a fact. It's a fact. But we have to say it's an opportunity, and if we don't take this opportunity as Europe, then others will do it for us.
So in, say, most of these things, whether it is the financial regulation or the financial system integration, Luxembourg is far ahead of the curve in many of these, and it's been very innovative, even on your ideas about how you think about data, which you explained about data embassy, you are very forward-looking.
You know,
But
when
no,
you're small, you have
question
to be better.
No, my question is it frustrating then to be part of a union which moves so slowly on these
No,
things?
no, I know. It's not frustrating because I wouldn't be successful without the others. So sometimes what we have in Europe, it's that some countries do not want to move on. And we have to rule that as long as not everybody's moving on, we cannot enter the plane to start to our destinations where we want to come. So maybe we should sometimes take the plane without them and leave them on the ground, and maybe they will have to take the bus and it will take longer to arrive at the goal. But we should also have projects where if one is not agreeing, we should doing it. Because if we as a European continent are not doing it, others will do it. And I don't want that Europe will be afterwards dependent on others.
And you've also been talking about diplomacy, European diplomacy, saying that Europe should be taking a much more proactive role in peacemaking, global peacemaking.
Yes, the fact is, I belong to the few leaders. I had contacts with President Zelensky and President Putin at the beginning of the war as a prime minister because I wanted to have a chance of dialogue. Very often we speak about each other but not to each other. And these forums here are the possibilities also to meet people that you are not able to see every day. I believe that diplomacy is always the first thing to do. Violence is never the right answer. I said when I had phone calls with President Putin, I told him, to start a war is easy, but to end the war,
extremely difficult.
that's to
And that's
show
what we are-
leadership.
That's what you're
That's
finding.
leadership, to end the war. And I believe that Europe has a role because when I see what happened in the Second World War, and when you go still today, you have Auschwitz, Birkenau, these places where millions of Jewish people, of gypsies, of disabled, of gay people were killed because they were different than the Nazi regime wanted them to be. And you have rooms full of hair, rooms full of glasses, rooms full of luggage, rooms full of shoes. And you have to know that every shoe was alive, every pair of shoes was alive. It's crazy, and it was human doing it. So it is so important to know how crazy people can be and how horrible we can be. And so diplomacy for me is always what I want to praise.
That's what worries us, and what is most worrying for people in this part of the world is that when you interact with Europe so much, not Luxembourg, but various parts of Europe, the talk today is war, war, war. Everyone is just talking about war. No one seems to be talking about peace. How do we resolve this?
No, it's not war. It's security. It's
No,
not
the
war.
two are
Because
related.
no. We need to have dissuasion. We need to be. I belong to a generation. I never lived a war. For me, peace was granted. Why should we invest in military? Why should we use military? Grew up in peace. Everybody was nice, easy, cheesy, peasy. Everybody was my brother, my friend, etc., etc. And then there came an attack from Russia. That's a fact. And we can rewrite the history that Ukraine's attacks, that's bullshit. Russia attacks Ukraine. And this is something, who will be the next tomorrow if we don't have the strength to show we are also able to defend ourselves. So it's not a
But
war,
the answer to
it's
that,
dissuasion.
as you correctly said, Excellency, is diplomacy.
Yes, but dissuasion is also important because diplomacy, if it's not working, when you know that the other part is also strong, you will think twice before doing one thing. I'm sure President Putin thought that Ukraine would be a question of 5 days and then it will be finished and they will give up. And they fought for us. And when you speak about peace, I fully agree, we all wish peace, all. But we cannot decide peace for Ukraine without Ukraine around the table.
So how do we get back to the table?
I think that initiative, if you like it or not, but every initiative, and also President Trump's initiative, and the Arabian facilitator, I spoke to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I said, you do great mediation. He said, no, I'm just a facilitator, I'm not doing mediation. But every possibility to have talks and to come to a ceasefire is the first step. But we cannot decide what is the future of Ukraine without Ukraine. We all want peace. Your Prime Minister wants peace, President Trump wants peace, and believe me, the one who wants the most peace are the Ukrainians. They want peace. But they don't want that other countries will decide what is going to happen with their own country, with their own life. And so it is important to have them around the table. So no decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine.
That is, they have to be part of the process. That goes without saying.
Well, you have some people, I don't know, some people who think they can decide without Ukraine what is good for them. So I'm happy that the last days we had again discussions between also Ukraine and the Americans, because to support Ukraine is not against America. It's too easy to say, if you support Ukraine, then you don't support the American initiative. No. What is important is to show support to Ukraine, and that we get the more partners that we can have. And America is a trusted partner for long years, and I'm sure these relations with the American states will continue to exist. And I will not forget what they did for us. You know, if I'm free elected in a democracy, it's because we had people. I have a cemetery, 4,000 young GIs. They didn't know where my country was. They'd never heard about Luxembourg, but they died for me. And so this is something we should never forget. And we will find the right partnership, I know, with the Americans. It's just, it's different. I worked 4 years with President Trump when I was Prime Minister. It's more deals. It's more, it's not just take, it's also give and take. And at the end of the day, it's not just in favor of Americans, it's in favor of partnerships and of trust. And I'm sure we will be able to do that the next 4 years.
So it is a beginning to be getting back into trust and letting diplomacy have a chance in sorting things out. And that's
you know, as chief of diplomacy, it's the third time that you say diplomacy is important. It's the third time I find excuses
I'm quoting you.
Yeah, but you are right. But you are right. But it's the third time that I don't say yes. And I should, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, say that diplomacy is the most important topic. But we need defense, we need dissuasion, we need diplomacy, and we need exchanges and respect. Respect. And respect is not imposing, it's discussing, finding solutions, and being able to live in peace. I wish that every child in this world is able to grow up like I did, not being considerate because of this or this or this or this, but just because who I am. And not because of the parents, not because of religions, not because of sexual orientation, not because of a color, etc., but just being able to be who I am, how I am, and to have my choices in my own life. And I would wish, because still today in 2025, if you're a girl or a man, if you're black or white or Asian, if you're Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist or Jewish, if you are gay, straight, if you are left-wing, if you are disabled, you don't have the same rights in some countries than others. And this is something where I also at the United Nations General Assembly, I don't scare to say it. People don't like to hear it, but don't forget, to be different is not a choice. It's our nature.
Thank you so much, Excellency, because what you're saying is what Raisina is all about also. That is why we are happy to have you here. We are about diplomacy, about getting different kinds of people together, different people who don't see eye to eye, put them in the same room and talk to each other. And I'm so glad you are here, and I hope you keep coming back to put this, to give this a further fillip as we go here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to Ideas Pod, hosted by the Observer Research Foundation and Firstpost. We are at the Raisina Dialogue 2025 in New Delhi. And I'm joined here to talk about AUKUS, the US, Australia, UK, US relationship. This was an agreement that was signed a few years ago to much fanfare, a security agreement which has proven quite important and somewhat controversial in some quarters. But we're here to talk a little bit about AUKUS, the future of the US-Australia relationship, and the broader implications for the Indo-Pacific. And I'm joined by two excellent guests. One is Bernard Philip, First Assistant Secretary from Australia, and also Abe Denmark, who is formerly Senior Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense dealing with AUKUS issues, now partner at the Asia Group and affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Abe, let me start with you. Maybe walk our viewers a little bit through AUKUS. What is AUKUS, and what are some of the elements of it?
Sure. So AUKUS is an agreement signed between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia to enhance our defense relationships. It's divided into two pillars. The first pillar is focused on helping Australia acquire a nuclear-powered submarine capability as their existing Collins class retires. So we're going to be helping that. It's the first time The United States has shared its naval nuclear propulsion technology with another country since we shared it with the United Kingdom in the 1950s. So this is a very big deal and a major initiative for all three countries. The second pillar of AUKUS, which is, you'll be surprised to hear, is called Pillar 2, is focused on enhancing other capability areas, cooperation between those three countries on advanced capabilities like quantum, electronic warfare, artificial intelligence, and the like. And that is the area where there's discussion about adding additional countries like Japan.
JAWCUS, I think, is the term.
That's, people like to add letters to various things on specific advanced capability projects within Pillar 2.
Mm-hmm. Great. Bernard, maybe talk a little bit through, it was a little bit controversial. It was sort of announced to some surprise initially. It does seem to have survived changes in government in both the UK and Australia, and then possibly also in the United States now. Maybe what changed in Australia's strategic outlook that led to AUKUS?
Well, Australia for some years has been assessing that our environment in the Indo-Pacific is becoming both higher risk and more unpredictable. So in that sense, we have been looking at what capabilities we can acquire to best meet our interests. In the case of undersea warfare, the opportunity presented by AUKUS and building on our very close partnerships with the United States and the United Kingdom, and in the case of the United States, our long-standing alliance, we have the opportunity to acquire a capability that's uniquely suited to our environment. Australia, as you know, is an island continent. We have the Pacific, Indian and Southern Oceans surrounding us. And so when it comes to naval capabilities, there's a high premium to be placed on speed and endurance. And in cooperation with our partners, we determined that this capability would give us a very significant edge as we seek to respond to our strategic circumstances.
Mm-hmm. If I can ask both of you, what was the, people understand Australia's strategic environment, the US has some of the most advanced defense technologies the United States possesses, and this is obviously a very strong relationship. What does the UK bring to the table?
Well, the United Kingdom is essential to how the United States builds, maintains, and operates our submarines. They've been a partner of the United States in this area since the 1950s, and they bring a lot of capability. They also bring ship production capacity. As I expect you're aware, and I expect we'll talk about, the United States has been facing challenges in our shipbuilding industry, and so having the United Kingdom participate in this and agree to cooperate with the Australians in constructing a new class of submarines that we're calling SSN AUKUS, I think is a critical element of AUKUS overall, and is a critical element of how the United Kingdom is contributing to Pillar 1. On Pillar 2, the United Kingdom has a lot of capabilities in advanced warfare and advanced technologies, and they bring that to the table as well.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I would echo what Abe says. I mean, the UK brings a very strong defence industrial base and a record of achievement over many decades. The Royal Australian Navy turns 125 next year, and over all of that period, it has worked very closely with the Royal Navy. So in that sense, I think it's a natural evolution of the partnership between our three countries, and we have obviously conducted operations over many decades and have a record of working together very effectively to contribute to global security.
Mm-hmm. Looking ahead a little bit, we've had changes in AUKUS has survived a change from the Sunak to the Starmer government. Again, it was announced, I think, under the Conservative government in Australia under Scott Morrison, I believe, and continued under Prime Minister Albanese. Now we've had a change in government in the United States from Biden to the Trump administration. Where do you see? Actually, maybe the first thing is, what's the sort of report card you could give on the progress to date on AUKUS, and where do you see it going forward? So maybe start with you.
So I think the U.S. has made good progress on AUKUS. It's probably a better grade in Pillar 1 than in Pillar 2.
Oh, really?
If I were to be honest. Pillar 1, I think we've been making good progress in terms of our cooperation. Our investments into the industrial base have been significant, and we're really laying the groundwork for robust cooperation. in Pillar 2, we've had some good accomplishments, especially in harmonizing our export control regimes, where we've created what is essentially an almost seamless environment for the three countries to trade defense capabilities with one another. I think that's extremely important. But what we haven't gotten in Pillar 2 is a real tangible capability that we can point to and say this is happening because of AUKUS. I know there's people who are thinking about what that could be, what kind of tangible capability we could develop, but that's something I think we're looking to happen over the coming years.
I believe there's some on UUV undersea vehicles that there has been some progress in that front, like with quantum navigation and
yeah, there's been a lot of progress in different areas, and I didn't want to discount those. But what we haven't seen is like a new missile, a new ship, a new whatever it may be that we can point to and say that's an AUKUS thing. Mostly it's happened in the software area, in the operational sphere, which are very important. But I think what we need in Pillar 2 at this point is something tangible that everybody can focus on and say this is demonstrating progress and the importance of Pillar 2.
Yeah, I would add that those projects that have delivered capability have certainly been a good demonstration of the ability of the three countries to work together closely. As Abe says, though, I think the foundation has really been set on the regulatory side and the reduction of those barriers to collaboration between the three countries, and we are working very hard to establish those projects that will make a real difference to the warfighter. On Pillar 1, this is obviously a very complex technology and a very complex national project that Australia is engaged on. Everything from making sure that our personnel are trained, which often involves serving on United States Navy or Royal Navy boats, establishing nuclear regulator, and putting in place the support and sustainment capabilities that we will need. We've already been able to support and sustain visiting US Navy SSNs, so our judgment is we are making good progress, but it is an incredibly complex enterprise.
Was that in Sydney or in Perth?
That was in Perth.
Perth, yeah, okay. I want to sort of also just sort of broaden the conversation a little bit. AUKUS has been important in some ways. It sent a signal. There was surprise across the broader Indo-Pacific and a lot of parsing of what the implications might be. Maybe start, Bernard, if I could ask you first. Maybe where do you see the future of the alliance headed? The U.S.-Australia alliance. I mean, many people are aware that Australia and the United States have fought in several wars together, going back 70+ years. Where do you see that going now under a Trump administration?
Well, as you say, Dhruv, we have served on the battlefield together for over a century now. We've had a formal alliance since the end of World War II, and during that period we've operated together in many locations around the world, and in our Indo-Pacific environment have worked very closely together to shape the strategic environment through the Cold War, into the Cold War period, and beyond. In terms of how we're thinking about the future of our alliance relationship, we continue to see it making a very important contribution to our security, but also we see the alliance as a real opportunity for our two countries to contribute to regional security. If you look at some of the recent developments in the alliance relationship, we've spoken about AUKUS, but there has been a growing US rotational presence in Australia through...
In Darwin?
In Darwin, in other parts of Australia through force posture initiatives. And again, that's an opportunity for our two countries to train and exercise together, and then in some cases contribute to regional security directly. We've also built out our exercise relationship, and so later this year we will hold the largest and most complex iteration of our exercise Talisman Sabre, which began as a bilateral exercise between Australia and the United States, but has now grown to have a much larger set of partners, and I think it's a good example of how the alliance can really contribute to regional security.
Abe, if one of the objectives, and feel free to contest this, was about shaping the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, if one of the objectives of AUKUS, do you think it is accomplishing that? Is AUKUS sufficient? Does more need to be done to achieve that objective?
Yeah, I think that AUKUS was and is just a part of what the United States has been doing across the Indo-Pacific in terms of modernizing our alliances across the region, strengthening our partnerships across the region, including with India, to make sure that we maintain the ability to sustain deterrence, support our allies, defend our interests across the region. Again, in the face of what we're seeing from China and North Korea, especially more assertive, more aggressive, and more concerning capabilities and behavior from them. So I think AUKUS has helped a great deal. I saw China make a very strenuous attempt to try to undermine AUKUS in the international system after it was announced, and they failed pretty significantly, both I think because of the great diplomacy that was done, especially by our colleagues in Australia and the United Kingdom, but also because of the facts on the ground. And our allies and partners across the region know what we're doing, what AUKUS is and what AUKUS isn't, and they see what China is doing across the region, how that affects their interests. So obviously I think there's more that we need to do to continue to strengthen our relationships, to buttress our military capabilities, to modernize our economic strategy and policy across the Indo-Pacific. But I do think that we're moving in the right direction. We've been seeing the United States enhance its strategy towards the Indo-Pacific for more than a decade now. I was part of the Obama administration rebalance effort, and I think you can trace its roots to back then to the Bush administration and before that. But there's still more that we need to do. The Trump administration is very focused on enhancing our own capabilities. They're taking a more transactional approach to our relationships, but despite what some folks may have, the anxiety some folks may have about these alliances, I think they're robust, they're bigger than any one person, than any one administration, and the strategic logic that they have for the United States, for our allies, for our partners, those don't change. So I'm fairly optimistic about how they're going forward.
So I can ask you this because you're no longer in government, but is there anything any sense that you've had from the Trump administration that they are seeking to relook or renegotiate or amend any major aspect of the AUKUS relationship so far?
I haven't seen that. I've seen the Secretary of Defense, I've seen the Secretary of State, both express significant support for AUKUS. And even Elbridge Colby, who during the Biden administration was a pretty significant critic of AUKUS, in his testimony said he wants to do everything that we can to make sure this succeeds. And I thought that was very important. There is going to be a debate in the United States about our shipbuilding industry, and there's going to be a major effort by the Trump administration, I expect, to strengthen our ability to produce ships, both military and civilian. And AUKUS Pillar 1 may get caught up in that, but I have a lot of confidence that the current administration supports AUKUS Pillar 1, and they want to make sure that our ability to produce submarines, to produce other military craft is increased, and which I see as in a lot of continuity with what we were trying to do during the Biden administration.
Final two questions, both to Bernard. First, there has been a certain degree of controversy or debate about AUKUS in Australia. It's become a domestic political issue. It's sort of seeped into popular culture in some ways. I saw a commercial for mutton or a lamb or something in Australia, which made a joke about AUKUS. But what are some of the, do you think those concerns are still there is there a consensus around it, at least in the Australian government? Are there concerns about costs that remain or anything else?
Look, as I mentioned earlier, AUKUS is a very complex and demanding national enterprise that Australia is embarked upon, but we are making very good progress across a wide set of issues. We're having to move quickly in order to meet the key milestones under AUKUS Pillar 1, but the commitment of the Australian government to doing so is very strong. As Abe has mentioned, the signals we have received from the Trump administration towards AUKUS Pillar 1 are very positive. What I would add is that we are pursuing a range of other approaches as well. In Australia's case, that means working very closely with our Pacific Island partners. We're here at Raisina, where the keynote speaker is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, our other ally. We are deepening our relationships with Japan, with India, with the Republic of Korea. We remain committed to working closely with ASEAN. So the capabilities that we are acquiring, including through AUKUS, are among a range of measures we're taking to respond to this more dangerous environment.
Last question, again, since we're in India, you alluded to it already. The first engagement of the new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was a meeting of the Quad foreign ministers. What do you see as the future of the Quad under the Trump administration? What would Australia like to prioritize, given that we're in India?
Yes, indeed. Well, look, we see the Quad as having made and continuing to make a positive contribution to regional security through the capabilities that the 4 members of the Quad bring. In Australia's case, I think we very much see a focus on maritime security as being an important element of the Quad. Our 4 defence forces are working increasingly closely in maritime security, including through our shared maritime patrol aircraft platforms. And we see a real demand across the region for countries to be able to improve their maritime domain awareness. And I think the 4 Quad partners, based on the capabilities they bring and their different geographies, are well placed to support the maritime security across the region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you for your candid remarks, and hopefully we'll see further development in the U.S.-Australia relationship, and with broader implications for all the rest of us in the years ahead. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Raisina Ideas Pod with Firstpost. We're going to be discussing developments in Europe, and I have Mr. Attila Demko, who is the head of the Strategic Foresight Program at the George Lukács Institute in Hungary, and I have Mr. Gladin Papin, who's president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Hungary, of course, has broken some of the old consensus, in a manner of speaking, in Europe, and their prime minister has taken some very forthright stance. Not made him the most popular guy, but I suppose people need to speak some home truths, and we'll probably discuss some of those today. So, Attila, my first question is to you. Over the last 15-20 years, we've seen a lot of wokeness in Europe, and very often from, sitting in, say, India, it seems Europe might be losing its strategic relevance. Do you think that is really the case because of, this growing conflict between a very woke kind of an ideology which seems to have taken over Europe, where Europe, we feel, is unable to take care of its own interests, protect its own interests, and of course the kind of posturing Europe does in the rest of the world. There seems to be a mismatch. How do you look at it?
Indeed, there are problems in Europe, economic problems, internal issues within countries, between countries, disagreements, and part of it is because of this ideological approach to internal policy, but also external policy. I think Europe is trying to punch above its weight. We should be more realistic. Europe is not the center of the world anymore. Actually, Asia is becoming the center of the world, and of course the United States is staying as a superpower. But Europe is not a superpower anymore, and we still talk to people, like people in India, like we have the moral high ground, like we know more, we see farther, we are bigger. We are not. And that's what I think Hungary is saying, that we have to be realistic. We shouldn't push our agenda, especially not to the outside world. What we think about the world as common values, not necessarily the values of Indians, 1.4 billion people. We are 450 million people in the European Union. So we should be realistic. And also within European societies, because this weakens Europe. If we have debates, such debates on migration, and migration is not a success story in Europe. There are a lot of conflicts in several major Western European countries. So if we continue like this, we are losing the outside world, and we are losing large parts of our societies, of our own societies. So we have to work on that. I definitely see a strategic slide in Europe. not only in economy, but also in our outreach. Our Indians are listening more to Europe than 20 years ago. I don't think so. They listen to us less. They respect Europe less than before. And I think much of it is for own making, so we have to change that.
So, Gladden, what we've seen happen in Europe is that, Attila talks about the migration crisis. Multiculturalism doesn't seem to have succeeded. In fact, when we see the kind of pressures which are coming into Europe, demands for Sharia rule in parts of Europe, and European states not able to push back. In fact, they seem to be diffident, they seem to be defensive, they seem to be almost apologetic. And it seems that they're in a kind of a self-destruct mode because they're not protecting the values which they espouse. Sitting in the US and you look at Europe, which has been a very close ally of the United States, how do you measure up Europe these days?
Well, I think you're right to point out these problems, and let's talk about the reasons why Europe has been acting in the way that it has. For much of the last 50 years, really in the post-World War II era as a whole, nationalism was identified by many people as the major cause of wars. And so international structures were built in order to mitigate the power of nations and nationalism. But what we're seeing now, particularly when you look at Europe, you see these surveys where people are asked, would you fight for your country in a war? Would you give your life for your country if it were invaded? And the numbers are very sobering. They're low. And if we actually want to have a secure world, a world in which nations can get along peacefully, at this point we need a resurgence of national identity, not in a revanchist way, not in an aggressive and warmongering way, but as a basis for one's civic identity. And that's going to come back. It already is coming back. The problem is that many European leaders are still trying to mitigate that. They're still trying to prevent it. They're trying to keep nationalist voices or pro-national sovereignty voices out of the public discourse. They're trying to limit the role that those political parties play in public life. And it's becoming a self-undermining thing. We can talk about security all we want, but as Vice President J.D. Vance asked at the Munich Security Conference, what is it for? What are we securing? And until European nations can, again, give an answer to that, of course, some of them can, Hungary certainly can, but until they can all give an answer to that and also allow these more patriotic voices to rise and to have a presence in the public discourse, then Europe will continue on this sideways and even downward path.
Yeah, so but what we are seeing happen in Europe is the kind of polarization which, for example, we've seen in the United States, we've seen in India, we've seen in some other countries where some of these voices have emerged and are pushing back against what was the erstwhile dominant narrative, doubling down on national identity and stuff like that. We've seen that starting to happen in Europe. We've seen that in the Netherlands. We've seen that in Hungary, of course. We've seen it in Germany right now, the resurgence with the AfD. We've seen it in France. We've seen it in the UK. Where do you think politics is going now? Is it moving completely to the right? Or is this some kind of a correction coming in to the kind of wokeness and ultra-liberal, I would even call it loony liberal kind of stuff which are starting to happen? Is it that kind of a shift taking place, or is it just a correction taking place?
Well, there is definitely a correction, but the world has also changed. What Gladden said is absolutely true. We are living in a much more dangerous world. If you are teaching our sons that your homeland is not important, how you expect to defend it for them? I mean, for a 20-year-old, if he's listening that your history is just bad, your identity is not important, you are European or you are a global citizen, then how will we defend ourselves? And of course, we are living in a dangerous world. So, yes, there is a correction. I think this woke revolution went way too far, and there is a backlash. But also, there are facts on the ground. There is a big war next to us, Russian aggression against Ukraine, and there is terrorism within Europe. So people see it and feel it on their own skin. that something is not good. So I think it's both. I think there's too much push from one side, but also the world has changed and we have to recover some lost values to be able to defend ourselves.
Do you see a kind of a dividing line between the erstwhile Eastern Europe, which was under the Soviet influence, and the Western Europe? Because we see the attitudes in the Eastern part very different from what it was in the Western part. Now, they're all part of the EU, or most of them are. How does that dynamic play out within the EU now? Because earlier, it was a similar kind of an ideological framework within which EU was operating. We've seen in the German elections, if you look at the results, the AfD really scores big in what was the former GDR. Similarly, in many of the other countries. And maybe I'm wrong, but I see that within the Eastern part, which was under Soviet domination, and the Western part, there seems to be, that divide which is there. So how does Europe now deal with this?
Well, born and raised in the United States, so I can only analyze as an analyst when considering the deep structural aspects of that, particularly within Central and Eastern Europe. But I think one thing that happened is that during the Cold War, there were all sorts of social processes that were going on in the West. There was a liberalization of mores, a more progressive interpretation of sex and things like that. And so the culture became more liberal. But at the end of the Cold War, what happened is that the Western leaders said, these are the reasons that we won. And therefore, we want to take these more radical values that have developed and export them everywhere. If we look at that as a package, there are some aspects of it that are good. Of course, we want to have societies that are based on the rule of law. We want to have elections. India is the largest democracy. All these things are important. But there was like an extra layer of that which really went too far. And I think what happened in Central and Eastern Europe, at least from those who lived through the Soviet times and emerged after it, many people initially wanted to adopt everything from the West. But over time they saw that the package that was being offered included a lot of pretty crazy stuff. And that stuff went too far. Now there's been a reaction against it. So you can see that a little bit in the, for example, you pointed to the map of the most recent German parliamentary elections, which showed the AfD very strong in the East. But I think that there's still a reservoir of common sense and everyday values that's fully modern and in favor of freedom, but not some of these excesses and, as you put it, Looney Tunes liberalism that we've seen grow up over time. And it's really important to step back from that. It's really important to just get back to normal. Why is the U.S. Army recruitment numbers going up so rapidly, even at the beginning of the Trump administration? The same thing happened there. Even the American military went too far in the woke direction. Ordinary people stopped wanting to join it. So everyone just needs to pull back from that and get back to good common sense, everyday values. That's something that was maintained in Central and Eastern Europe. That's why you see it reflected at the political level too.
Okay, before I go back to Attila, let me ask you this, because you're from the US. We've seen some pretty straight talk happen from the American side on Europe.
Yeah.
On not just J.D. Vance, but I think President Trump himself has been saying certain stuff, basically asking the Europeans to start paying their bills. How does the American-European relationship proceed from here on? Is the American administration or the Trump administration trying to knock some sense into the Europeans to wake up, and get out of the kind of stupor they've been in, that America is there to pull all their chestnuts out of the fire? Is it about that? Or does it signify something even more fundamental in how Europe and the United States will relate with each other?
Well, the fundamentals of the relationship, I think, are strong. After all, it is a shared civilization in which Europe gave birth to many of the ideas that ultimately even formed the government and society in the United States. So really nothing can change that. But beyond that, a lot can change and a lot of things need to change. As of a year ago, things were looking, in my opinion, pretty bad for the West as a whole, for the United States and for Europe. There was an ideology that we've been talking about that was very strong on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it was becoming unsustainable. It was like an unsustainable version of liberalism. And, well, America has been the first to reinvent itself again. So America has reinvented itself. It wants to pull back from those things that we were talking about and compete better in this new emergent multipolar age. The question is whether the European liberal leaders will also adjust. Now, already it's clear that they recognize their need to improve their defense spending. This ideological level, that still has to change. So the Trump administration, in my reading, has been giving tough love to the European leaders and to the leaders of the European Union. It's not tearing up all of the values that go into the Western civilization. It's not tearing up the whole transatlantic relationship. Far from it. Things were unsustainable. It has to be reinvented, and that's why tough love, I think, from the U.S. side is a good first step.
Attila, not just as a Hungarian, but as a European, what is the great threat to Europe right now? Is it Russia, or is it your own internal weaknesses which seem to be developing? Across the continent, we are seeing the kind of new forces which are emerging. We are seeing that countries are not even able to enforce their own rules. We used to hear about two-tier policing in third world countries, but we are seeing two-tier policing in Europe. We are seeing a level of political correctness which we never thought would ever happen. You know, it's nice to be polite, but to be politically correct to a point where it becomes disastrous is something which we are seeing happen in Europe. So what is really eating up the vitals of European society? Is it what is happening internally in these countries and their inability to fix their politics, or is it the Russia threat? Or is the Russia threat might be real up to an extent, or is it also a red herring of sorts? Because you don't want to address the burning questions internally, so you know everything becomes Russia, Russia, Russia.
Yeah, it's easy to say Russia, 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 but Russia has an economy 10 times smaller than the European economy. Russia has 150 million people at most. European Union has 450 million people. What we didn't do for 20 years, spending on the military. If you don't spend, you don't have large and strong militaries. Major European states have 200 tanks, main battle tanks each. Russia have 3,000-4,000, even after losing so many in Ukraine. Russia is one problem. We have another problem on the Mediterranean. Very unstable countries. Starting from Libya, which I think it was a mistake to attack back by the NATO mission, to Syria, which is again in deep trouble, Iraq, which is not that stable. We have big problem with Iran. So it's not only Russia. We have a unstable eastern border and a very unstable southern border. Both are very unstable. So I think but we have the means, we have the money, we have the economic resources. So we have to rearm Europe, both mentally and in reality with hardware.
But do you have the stomach for a fight?
Well, it's a good question. You know, Europe is quite big, not as big as India by population, but I think on the east, yes. So we are different. We are different on the east. I think Poland is a very good example. They are rearming themselves, very strong army. Finland is a great example. I think the Baltic states are doing quite a lot. Hungary is doing quite a lot. We are building 6 factories which will produce military hardware, or some of them are already producing. So if you compare Hungary, which is a country of 10 million, we do much more than Germany, which is a country of more than 80 million. I mean, comparatively, comparing the size of the economy and the population. They are not building 60 factories right now. They are doing some things, and they are, you know, I think there are good moves with the new government in Germany, but it's too little, too late. So actually, Europe is not one. As Gladden said, let's say, former communist Europe, former occupied Europe, because we were occupied by the Soviet Union. We were not happy allies of the Soviet Union. Our relationship was not as good as the Indian-Soviet relationship. We were occupied by them. So we remember those times. We are much more alert, not only because of Russia, because of also migration, but because that's a threat. I mean, look at the French army. They have to keep troops on their own soil to patrol the streets. So those French soldiers who are on the streets of Marseille, they are not in Estonia, they are not in Latvia, they are not defending France. So that's the problem. It's not one problem. This Russia, it's easy. It's very easy politically, this is very fashionable, but we have a lot of problems. And what America is doing, forcing us finally to spend money. Actually, the first Trump administration was very useful for Europe. Some countries woke up listening to President Trump at the time. And, you know, he's using tough language, sometimes even rude language. But we have to wake up. Since we spent much less than the 2% we promised in 2014, in 2025, there are, but sorry, one more word. Spain and Italy are among the biggest members, and they are not spending even 1.5% on defense.
So before I go back to Glenn, if you are going to raise your defense spending to, say, the 5% point, from, say, about 2.5%, or even less, 5, even if you do it over a couple of years, you will have to divert money from the normal kind of, you know, social welfare schemes which are very popular in Europe. What is going to be the political impact of that?
Well, you know, if somebody says Russia, then of course you have to change your internal policies. Social policy in Germany is so generous that many people simply doesn't work. They do not work. Why? Because they get the money for life. And you know, you have to change this. You have to change unemployment benefits, social benefits, health leave, a lot of things to change in Germany, France, many other countries. It's their choice. What we are doing in Hungary, you have 3 months unemployment benefit and it's very low. So you have to work. Well, we are a good example. We are ready to help Germany.
Right. So, Glenn, last question. You know, I've looked at the United States. People in the US work really hard. They start early, work till late. And I look at Europe. Frankly, I'd love to be a European and live the comfortable life. But can Europe afford that kind of lifestyle anymore? Because they're not competitive anymore. They're not efficient anymore. If you want a phone connection now, it would probably have to wait for a week. You want a bank account, you probably have to wait even longer. It's crazy the way Europe works, and it's supposed to be an economic powerhouse. Do you think it can stay like that if they do not bring in necessary reforms, some of which Attila just spoke about?
Well, you're right. And actually, there is something that Europe is still very good at, which is manufacturing. It's a very important manufacturing center, whereas actually the United States has lost a lot of its manufacturing. That's part of the origin of Trump, is that a lot of factories had moved to China. The U.S. economy became very financial. You can have really big asset values. You have these extraordinarily expensive companies. But Europe and the U.S. still need one another. They can trade in these areas. The U.S. can sell its high-tech services to European countries, and a lot of European manufacturing is exported to the United States. So, but you're right that there's a problem here. It's not just about reforming the inside of the European institutions. Most of the existing EU leaders would prefer to say that, well, in order to solve these problems, you have to give away more of your national sovereignty to Brussels. But the problem is that at the strategic level, the problem is in the head, as it were. What is the strategic vision for Europe in the next 5 or 10 years? This crop of EU leaders have not really been asking that question. They've been making decisions on autopilot and haven't really thought about that. So before we give them another opportunity to amass more cross-EU regulatory power in Brussels, we need to have this conversation about in what areas Europe can be more competitive in the next 5 years, and what are the conditions for that, and then do it. There's been a meme going around in the last year pointing out that Elon Musk, as representing America somehow is able to land the rocket in reverse, whereas the European Union regulation has created the bottle cap that won't be detached from the bottle. And this is a joke, but there's a reality behind that. And the issues that you raise are important, but what's really lacking to me as a student of strategy and a participant in those international discussions, you have to decide the goals and then formulate the strategy, not the reverse. And that conversation is what really needs to be reset in Europe.
Last question, same question to both of you, 10 seconds each. Can the EU reform and reform in a way that it actually, starts working for the European people rather than for the bureaucracies?
The weaker we are, the weaker we are. We have to realize that, and if we realize that, we can reform.
Glenn?
There is a new party grouping in the European Parliament, which is the Patriots for Europe group. These parties have in many cases been excluded from public discourse in their countries by the mainstream as representing too extreme of an alternative. That's, for the most part, not the case. So in order for the EU institutions to reform, I think we have to allow this discussion. That's why the US has been emphasizing the importance of freedom of speech, because in Europe there has been a kind of clampdown in recent years regarding discussion of precisely these matters. So open the airwaves again, allow everyone to debate what the strategy is that European leaders should choose next, and then I think we'll see that same ability to reinvent come in Europe as well.
Or you could always come to Raisina Dialogue and discuss it openly. Thanks a lot.
Here we are.
Thanks a lot.
This is Ideas Pod at Raisina 2025 with Firstpost, and we have our special guest today, His Excellency Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Mariano Grossi. Director General Grossi, welcome to Raisina 2025 Ideas Pod. Energy is a hot topic today, and energy has become very much enmeshed in the geopolitics of the hour.
Yes.
We've seen energy being used as a weapon. We've seen flows of energy being disrupted, whether by the Houthis in the Red Sea, or in the case of Nord Stream 2 by an act of sabotage. So energy is definitely being weaponized. And even the financial system, the interbanking system, which kind of facilitates energy trade, that also has been turned into a weapon. Now, in this context, there is a rekindling of interest in nuclear energy, which had kind of gone on the back burner, especially in Europe, after Fukushima. Why do you think nuclear energy is on the way back? Why is there a resurgence of interest?
Well, indeed, what you said is right. We have a debate today on energy which transcends the energy-specific realm by going into what we call now energy security and other areas or descriptions of the issue. I think when it comes to nuclear energy, what we are seeing is what I like to describe as a return to realism, more than renaissance or revolution or grandiose adjectives to describe it. I think it's a return to realism because quite obviously we live in an economy which in many cases, in most of the cases, is in need of bigger degrees of electrification in a quest for decarbonization in many countries. And the need for baseload energy is very clear. Nuclear energy has always been there, and there is a realization, which was quite evident at the COP28, the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention in Dubai 2 years ago, when in the final document you would find a very unexpected formulation with every country, not only nuclear countries, said nuclear energy must be accelerated alongside renewables. So this was a first. It was almost a Copernican moment since nuclear energy was, as you said, the back burner or even ostracized by some. What we see now is enormous interest and growth In India, growth, real growth. In China, in Japan, return, big time. In North America, in Canada, in parts of South America, and even in Europe, where you have the only case of phasing out after a sort of conventional wisdom that people were moving out. In the end, it was only one country that phased out, and it lends itself to an analysis in and by itself. We are not getting into that, but we see in many countries this. And interestingly, when you combine this with your premise of the energy security, it's obvious that we see an intense interest in nuclear energy in Central and Eastern Europe. Czechia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and even Poland, which was the only country in that part of the world which had not introduced nuclear energy. And this has an obvious energy security connotation because of a previous energy mix where gas coming from the east was prevalent. So we see all that, and we see different drivers for this, which is a fact.
So a healthy dose of realism, you were saying. Now let me get back to the realism question. That see, fossil fuels at least were better distributed. Now, as far as nuclear fuels are concerned, there's still a concentration, if you talk about production, in key countries. Maybe Ukraine, Australia, a few others, which really control 2/3 of the trade in uranium. Yeah? So how does this look for energy security when fuels can be weaponized, the supply is disrupted, and nuclear has always been a subject of geopolitics because of non-proliferation concerns and everything else. So does this not add to the uncertainty, the insecurity, rather than the safety of nuclear energy?
Well, when you look into the uranium production, there is no shortage of uranium at the moment. There are some people who are speculating about the tripling of current nuclear capacities and whether that would happen by 2050, and they
No, I'm not even talking about quantities of the enough quantities of oil. I'm talking about the geopolitics of it, and I'm talking about concerns, issues, embargoes. In the case, say, there are so-called proliferation fears, going into the wrong hands. No, there's a whole lot of other geopolitical
when it comes to
nuclear.
Let's go one by one. When it comes to non-proliferation, of course, this is one of the raison d'etre of the IAEA. There's no any country can simply switch on a nuclear reactor, small or big or of any size, without being inspected, unless this country is outside the NPT regime. And even when you are inside the NPT regime, like in the case of India and others, you do have a specific inspection scheme. It is impossible, with the exception perhaps of one country, to have a nuclear program and being completely outside any international monitoring. So the prospect of the spread of nuclear technology being equated to a diminution or a decrease of security because of proliferation concern is very remote. Is very remote because the IAEA is there. True, with the war in Europe, for example, there have been sanctions, there have been limitations which are not specific to the nuclear sector. You can see that being replicated or applied to other sectors. So I don't see this as a nuclear specific or nuclear inherent problem that you may have.
Okay, there's some interesting ideas also which have come out of the IAEA. For example, you have the low enriched uranium bank in Kazakhstan to enable people to create stockpiles. Are stockpiles the answer to some of this?
Well, I must say this was something that was developed more than 20 years ago. And at that time, I think it has a value, but at that time there was an idea that as a way to reassure countries that they would always have access to fuel, perhaps without having to enrich uranium, could be to have international banks. That idea, I must say, did not materialize
So that is not workable, and that is not
well,
workable.
it is good in the limited way it has come to be. We have, and we are very grateful to Kazakhstan, who is hosting this LEU bank, which contains enough fuel to load 1 or 2 cores of a nuclear reactor. But in the end, the original idea, I want to say, was a different concept, which was more ambitious, and I don't think that road has been followed in reality, because there hasn't been any specific shortage. And frankly speaking, limitation of technologies is an idea that is very difficult to be accepted. At some point, there were also a group of countries that were saying, okay, if you want to have nuclear, we can help you, provided you yourself say that you're not going to do this or that. That is a concept which, of course, was resisted. I can understand why that happened. I think more than cutting the access to technology to countries, what you need to have is a good abidance to the non-proliferation regime, being inspected when you have to, like an auditor, like a taxman that comes and says, are you in good standing with your obligations, more than saying, well, there's some things that you cannot do.
So, no, there's a very important phrase here, cutting access to technologies.
Yeah.
Nuclear technologies are very closely held.
Yes.
And the fear is that because of those closely held technologies, it is far more difficult to democratize access to nuclear energy. That is one of the biggest challenges which comes in the way of energy security to the nuclear option, I would say. Now, is there something down the horizon which you could tell us about, and just look forward the future in the development of technologies? Are any of the new technologies like small beta reactors, molten salt reactors, how close are they to commercialization? To take care of some, first of all, will they take care of these concerns? Can they take care of some of these concerns? And how far are we from getting them commercialized?
Small modular reactors are very interesting because, I mean, it's in their name. Small is small, which means
small
that
is beautiful.
Small is beautiful, sometimes not necessarily, but let's say that small is beautiful, as the saying goes. It is easily deployable. It is relatively cheaper than big. It
gets rid of the problem of not in my backyard.
It is
and safety.
Exactly. It is modular, which means that you can have a small modular reactor where you have 2 or 3 modules, and you add one more if the village or the town that is being fed grows, or the data center that is connected to it is also expanding. So all of these elements which you didn't have in the typical normal nuclear reactors make it very attractive. It doesn't mean that this is the new nuclear, that this is going to replace the traditional nuclear power plants as we know them. This is going to be a different path, a different alternative, if you want, which is going to be catering for different types of needs. Desalination in some countries, access in, for example, in very big countries like India, where you have remote places which might not be well connected to the grid, you can have small modular reactors. Or in Siberia, or I don't know, in Patagonia, in my own country. So in remote places, or related to specific functions, like data centers or steel, or very interesting to shipping. The shipping industry is looking at naval propulsion, naval nuclear propulsion, not submarines, the commercial mercantile shipping industry. So as you can see, there are new, I mean, like in the economy and technology, there are new things that are happening. There are new alternatives, new possibilities, new options. And interestingly, nuclear is offering different products to cater to these new needs.
So, and what is the status of the commercial viability? How far away are we from that?
Well,
will they be competitive?
Well, again, it's 2 different questions. In the first place, I think we are not seeing them yet. They are in the process. some of them, we do have in Russia, in China, which were more for demonstration purposes because they are not intensely looking into that, although they have the technology. For example, in the case of Russia, you have floating nuclear power plants, which are very interesting. Some African countries are looking into that, for example. It's very interesting. So, but in general, here in India or in Western Europe or the United States, what we have are designs that are being developed. They have to be licensed. Nuclear licensing takes a little bit of time. So for the first of a kind, FOAK, for the first of a kind, it might take 6-7 years. Once you have a first of a kind, the nth of a kind, it's going to be, and that's a little bit the business model. Once you have a modular, it's going to be like the commercial aviation air industry, where you are going to have like turbines that are fabricated in series.
What about alternate fuel cycles away from uranium? Thinking in terms of thorium, thinking in terms of fast breeder reactors, which use different.
They are all interesting. I think thorium has historically been of great interest in India because of the availability of the mineral here. The reality of the market is at the moment it's still the cycle is still centered around uranium, but thorium has every possibility. I think it's a matter of scalability and money more than anything else. But even this can change. So I see very good prospects. In terms of other non-traditionally cooled reactors like molten salts and others, there are different models. There's high temperature gas cooled reactors, there's molten salt. They are different. I think all of them are viable. We are seeing them. In Russia there will be one. In India we have one. So I see these as alternatives that the industry is developing and as proof again of the innovation that you see in nuclear. Some people say nuclear is an industry of the 1940s. Of course, this is not true. As we can see, there are all these different alternatives that you have to have fission that can be metered.
So do you see nuclear as the energy of the 21st century?
It's one of them.
One of them.
Is one of them. We do not advocate nuclear energy dominance. We do affirm the validity of nuclear as baseload energy, very dependable, very reliable. We are going to be having reactors. The reactors that India is commissioning now will be here for almost 100 years.
Thank you. Thank you so much for educating us all about what is happening in the field of nuclear energy and your optimism. I think it is breathtaking. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Great to be here with you.
Welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod. I'm Navdeep Suri. I was Ambassador of India to UAE. And we have with us a very special guest today, Minister Noura bint Al-Kabi, bin Muhammad Al-Kabi. And she is the Minister of State for Public Diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has held a number of important portfolios in the past, including Minister of Culture. Today we're going to talk about public diplomacy. And I know that for many of our viewers, you may not be aware of the idea, how can diplomacy be public? Diplomacy is supposed to be conducted behind closed doors and confidentially and so on. But over the last couple of decades, the notion of public diplomacy as not just engaging between government to government, but dealing with the public of a foreign country directly or the foreign publics directly across a host of different dimensions. Minister, you've held this portfolio now for a while, and I wanted to talk to you about how public diplomacy is used to enhance and project a country's soft power. How is it used to enhance a nation's brand? And UAE has been remarkably successful. I think it's climbed to the top 10 of the world's soft power index in next to no time at all. What are the strategies that are making this work?
First of all, Ambassador Navdeep, or if I can say my friend Navdeep, it's really wonderful to be here. It's my first time at the Raisina Forum, my first time in New Delhi. I'm very much excited. The energy here is very kind of contagious and buzzing, so I would like to thank also the organizers for organizing such a successful event. Now, talking about the role of public diplomacy, and as you mentioned, diplomacy is something that is always with closed doors, classified, and I think mainly people will think a diplomat is always going to discuss, let's say, more of a political issues, confidential issues, and whatever, the conduit of a message or how to build relationships between countries and multi-countries at the same time. But I think the essence of anything we do is people. I mean, I worked in the Ministry of Culture, and during my tenure back then, we looked at the importance of looking at how culture is the best bridge to build a relationship with a country. Prior to that, I worked in the film industry, and I saw how it's important